Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here with some stories from the wild side of Reddit. Whether you're grinding through some work, building something epic in Minecraft, or just need some background noise while you tackle that never-ending to-do list, you're in the right place. I've got a collection of stories that range from mildly annoying to absolutely jaw-dropping. So grab whatever you're sipping on, get comfortable, and let's dive into some stories that prove reality is way stranger than fiction. Our first story comes from someone who learned that family doesn't always mean honesty, especially when streaming services are involved. I found out my sister used my Netflix for 2 years and lied about paying me back. This might sound like a small thing, but hear me out because the math on this is absolutely wild. So about 2 years ago, my sister Nora asked if she could use my Netflix account temporarily. She'd just moved out of our parents' house and was trying to save money while getting settled. I figured, sure, family helps family, right? She promised she'd get her own account once she got her first paycheck from her new job. That was 2 years ago. For the first few months, I didn't really think about it. Netflix is one of those things you just kind of forget about since it auto-charges your card. But then I started noticing weird stuff showing up in my continue watching list. Rom-coms I'd never heard of, true crime documentaries that definitely weren't my style, and this one Korean drama that had like 40 episodes. When I asked Nora about it, she laughed it off and said she'd been meaning to get her own account but kept forgetting. She promised she'd send me money for her share, maybe $10 a month to cover half the subscription. I said that sounded fair. That was 18 months ago. Every few weeks I'd bring it up casually. Hey, don't forget about that Netflix money. Oh yeah, she'd say. I'll send it to you next week when I get paid. Next week would come and go. And when I'd mention it again, she'd act like it was the first time we'd ever discussed it. The thing is, Nora isn't struggling financially anymore. She got a promotion 6 months into that job, moved into a nicer apartment, bought a new car. I'd see her posts on social media about weekend trips and expensive dinners out, but somehow she never had $10 to spare for Netflix. Last month, I decided to actually do the math. My Netflix subscription is $20 a month. If she's been using it for 2 years, that's 24 months. Even if we split it 50-50, she owes me $10 a month for 24 months. That's $240. But here's the thing that really gets me. She hasn't just been using the basic Netflix features. When I logged into my account to check our viewing history, I discovered she'd upgraded my plan to the premium version without asking me. You know, the one that costs more but lets you watch on more screens in 4K, that bumped my monthly bill up to $25. So now we're talking about $12.50 a month for 2 years. That's $300 total, minus what I would have paid for my own basic plan anyway. She still owes me over $250 for a service she's been using every single day. The breaking point came last week when I was at a family dinner and overheard her talking to our cousin about how she's been binge-watching this new series. She was going on and on about how great Netflix is, how she's totally addicted to their original shows, how she stays up until 3 in the morning watching episodes. I pulled her aside after dinner and brought up the money again. This time, instead of promising to pay me next week, she got defensive. She said I was being petty over a few dollars, that family should help each other out, that she didn't realize I was keeping track of every penny. A few dollars, $250 is a few dollars. Then she had the nerve to suggest that maybe I should just cancel Netflix altogether if money was so tight for me, as if I'm the one who's been freeloading off someone else's account for 2 years. I told her she had until the end of the month to either pay me what she owes or get her own account, because I was changing my password. She accused me of being selfish and said she didn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of nothing. Nothing. $250 and 2 years of lies is nothing. The really frustrating part is that this has become a pattern with Nora. She borrowed my car last year and returned it with an empty gas tank. She's crashed at my apartment multiple times without contributing anything to groceries or utilities. She even asked to borrow money for her security deposit when she moved, which I gave her, and she's never mentioned paying that back either. I'm starting to realize that Nora doesn't see these things as debts or favors. She sees them as entitlements. Like being her sister means I'm automatically obligated to subsidize her lifestyle. The worst part is how she's managed to make me feel guilty about wanting my own money back. She's turned it into this narrative where I'm the bad guy for caring about money more than family. But it's not about the money. Not really. It's about the fact that she's been lying to me for 2 years, making promise after promise she never intended to keep. I changed my Netflix password yesterday. She texted me 3 hours later, asking why it wasn't working. When I reminded her about our conversation and told her she needed to get her own account, she said she couldn't afford it right now. Couldn't afford it. The same person who just posted photos from a weekend spa trip. That story ends there. The math doesn't lie, and neither should family. $250 over 2 years while playing the victim, when called out, is some next-level manipulation. Some people really will take advantage of anyone, even their own siblings, and then act shocked when there are consequences. Our next story takes us into the wonderful world of parking disputes, where common sense apparently goes to die. My neighbour keeps parking in my driveway, even after I ask them to stop. I'm not sure if this counts as a legal issue or just a human decency issue, but I'm at my breaking point with this situation. I live in a small house with a single-car driveway. Nothing fancy, just a narrow strip of concrete that leads from the street to my garage. It's clearly on my property, clearly marked by the obvious boundary lines, and clearly the only parking space I have. My neighbour Elias lives next door in a similar house, but his driveway is on the opposite side of his property from mine. This means that to get from his front door to his driveway, he has to walk around the side of his house. My driveway, on the other hand, is maybe 20 feet from his front door. About 6 months ago, I started noticing Elias's car in my driveway when I'd come home from work. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake or an emergency situation. Maybe his driveway was blocked by a delivery truck, or maybe he had guests over and needed the extra space temporarily. The first few times it happened, I didn't say anything. I just parked on the street and figured it would sort itself out. But then it became a regular thing. I'd come home and find his car in my spot, forcing me to park on the street in front of other people's houses. After about 2 weeks of this, I knocked on his door and politely asked if everything was okay. I explained that I'd noticed his car in my driveway several times and wanted to make sure there wasn't some kind of emergency or situation I could help with. Elias looked at me like I was crazy. He said he'd been parking there because it was more convenient for him, closer to his front door, easier to unload groceries, that kind of thing. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like, of course, he would use my driveway if it was more convenient. I told him I understood the convenience factor, but that it was actually my driveway, and I needed to be able to use it. He seemed genuinely surprised that this was a problem for me. He asked if I was using the driveway all the time anyway, and when I said yes, I use it every day when I come home from work, he suggested that maybe we could work out some kind of schedule, a schedule for my own driveway. I explained that I didn't want to work out a schedule because it was my property and I needed access to it whenever I wanted. That's when Elias got a little defensive. He said he didn't see what the big deal was, that neighbours should help each other out, and that I was being unreasonable about a small inconvenience. Small inconvenience, having to park on the street every day because someone else is using your driveway, is apparently a small inconvenience. I thought that conversation had settled things, but I was wrong. The very next day, I came home to find Elias's car in my driveway again. This time, when I knocked on his door, he seemed annoyed that I was bothering him about it. He said he'd forgotten about our conversation and that he'd try to remember next time, but it kept happening. Every few days, sometimes multiple days in a row, I'd find his car in my spot. The excuses started getting more creative. He was running late for work and didn't have time to walk to his own driveway. He had heavy groceries and couldn't carry them the extra distance. His back was acting up and he needed to minimize walking. It was raining and he didn't want to get wet walking around his house. Each time he'd promise it wouldn't happen again, and each time it would happen again within a few days. Last month, I decided to try a different approach. I left a polite note on his windshield, explaining that I needed to use my driveway and asking him to move his car. When I got home from work, the note was gone, but the car was still there. That weekend, I knocked on his door again. This time, Elias was openly irritated with me. He said I was being petty and obsessive about the driveway situation. He pointed out that his car wasn't hurting anything by being there, and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. He actually suggested that maybe I should just park on the street permanently, since it didn't really matter where I parked as long as I had a parking spot somewhere. He said it would solve the whole problem and we could both be happy. Both be happy in a scenario where he gets to use my property and I get to park wherever I can find space on the street. I tried explaining property rights and boundaries, but Elias just kept coming back to the convenience argument. Why should he have to walk an extra 50 feet to his own driveway, when mine was right there and not being used at that exact moment? The situation escalated 2 weeks ago when I came home and found not just Elias's car in my driveway, but also a car I didn't recognise. Apparently, he told one of his friends that they could park there too, since there was room for 2 cars if they squeezed together. When I confronted him about this, Elias acted like I was overreacting. He said his friend was only visiting for a few hours, and that I should be glad he was making efficient use of the space. Efficient use of my space. I told him that if I found any cars in my driveway again, I'd have them towed. Elias laughed and said I was being dramatic, that no tow truck would come out for something so petty, and that I was probably bluffing anyway. He wasn't wrong about the tow truck. When I called, they said it would be expensive and time-consuming, and they recommended I try to work it out with my neighbour first. Apparently, even though it's clearly my property, getting someone towed from your own driveway is more complicated than you'd think. Yesterday, I came home to find Elias's car in my driveway again. This time, I didn't knock on his door. I parked directly behind him, blocking him in completely. About an hour later, Elias was pounding on my door, furious that he couldn't get his car out. He said I was being ridiculous and immature, that blocking him in was way worse than anything he'd done. I told him I'd move my car as soon as he agreed to stop parking in my driveway. He said that wasn't fair because he needed to get to work in the morning. I said that wasn't my problem, since he'd chosen to park on someone else's property without permission. We went back and forth for 20 minutes before he finally agreed to stop using my driveway. I moved my car and he left for work this morning from his own driveway. But I have a feeling this isn't over. This afternoon, I noticed him standing in his yard, staring at my driveway with this calculating look on his face. That story is over. The entitlement is absolutely staggering. Imagine thinking you can just use someone else's property because it's more convenient for you, then acting like they're the unreasonable one for wanting access to their own driveway. Some people truly believe the world exists to make their lives easier. Moving on to our next tale of family boundary violations, this one hits different because it involves childhood memories and the things we hold on to for emotional reasons. My mom gave away my childhood bed without telling me. This happened 3 weeks ago, and I'm still processing it because it feels like such a violation of trust and boundaries. I'm 23 and moved out of my parents' house about 8 months ago for my first real job in another city. It's been an adjustment, living on my own, managing my own space, all that adult stuff. But one of the things I was really looking forward to was eventually being able to bring some of my childhood furniture with me once I got settled and found a more permanent place. My childhood bedroom set had been with me since I was 7 years old. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden bed frame, matching dresser and nightstand that my parents had bought when we moved into that house. But it had sentimental value, you know? It represented stability and home and all those good childhood memories. When I moved out, I was staying in a tiny furnished studio apartment while I looked for something bigger. My mum, Juliet, offered to keep my bedroom furniture safe until I found a place where I could use it. She said she understood how important it was to me, and that she'd make sure nothing happened to it. I was grateful for that. Moving is expensive and complicated enough without having to worry about storing furniture you're not ready to use yet. Plus, my childhood room had become sort of a guest room anyway, so it made sense for the furniture to stay there temporarily. About 2 months ago, I started looking at one-bedroom apartments in my new city. I was excited about the prospect of having my own space that I could actually decorate and make feel like home. I started making lists of what I'd need to buy and what I could bring from my old room. The bed was at the top of my list, not because it was expensive or anything, but because it felt like a piece of home that I could bring with me. Something familiar in a new place, something that connected my old life to my new one. I called my mum a few weeks ago to talk about logistics. When would be a good time to rent a truck and come get my stuff? Would she be able to help me load everything? Basic moving coordination stuff. That's when she got quiet on the phone. After a long pause, she said we needed to talk about the furniture situation. My heart immediately started racing because that tone of voice never means anything good. She told me she'd given my bedroom set to my cousin's daughter, who had just turned 7 and needed furniture for her new room. Juliet explained that my cousin had been struggling financially after a divorce and couldn't afford to buy a bedroom set for her kid. I asked when this had happened, and my mum said about a month ago. A month. She'd given away my furniture a month ago and was just now telling me about it. When I asked why she hadn't checked with me first, she said she didn't think it was a big deal since I wasn't using it anyway. She said I was an adult now and didn't need a childhood bed, and that it made more sense for a child to use it than for it to just sit in storage. I tried to explain that I had been planning to use it, that I'd specifically told her I wanted to take it with me when I moved into a bigger place. She said she didn't remember that conversation and that I should have been clear about my intentions. The thing that really got to me was how she framed it as this generous, family-helping family gesture. She kept talking about how happy my little cousin was with her new bedroom, how grateful my cousin was for the help, how good it felt to be able to solve someone's problem with furniture that was just sitting there unused. But it wasn't unused, it was being stored. There's a huge difference between something being abandoned and something being temporarily stored until it's needed. I told my mum I was upset and felt like she'd given away my property without permission. She got defensive and said it wasn't really my property since my parents had bought it originally. She said I was being selfish for caring more about furniture than about helping family members who were struggling. That hurt. She was making it sound like I begrudged my cousin having furniture for her daughter, which wasn't the case at all. If she'd asked me beforehand, I probably would have said yes to giving it away, especially if they really needed it. But the fact that she made that decision without involving me at all felt like such a violation. The conversation got more heated when I pointed out that she could have at least given me a chance to get the furniture before giving it away. My mum said there wasn't time for that my cousin needed it immediately, and I lived too far away to come get it quickly. But that wasn't true either. My cousin lives in the same city as my parents. If it was such an urgent situation, they could have bought something temporary and waited for me to arrange pickup of my stuff. Or they could have asked other family members to help, or they could have looked into second-hand stores or charity furniture programs. Instead, my mum chose the easiest solution for everyone except me. When I asked if there was any chance of getting the furniture back, she said absolutely not. My little cousin was already settled in her new room, and it would be traumatic to take her furniture away. Besides, she said, what kind of person takes furniture away from a 7-year-old? The kind of person whose furniture it was in the first place, apparently. The worst part of this whole thing is that my mum genuinely doesn't understand why I'm upset. She keeps saying I'm overreacting about material possessions and that I should be happy the furniture is going to good use. She said she raised me to be more generous and less attached to things. But it's not about being attached to things. It's about feeling like my wishes and plans don't matter to her. It's about her making major decisions that affect my life without including me in the conversation. It's about feeling like she sees me as a child, whose opinions don't need to be considered. I've been furnishing my new apartment with second-hand stuff from Facebook Marketplace and thrift stores. It's fine, and honestly, some of the pieces I've found are nicer than my old furniture would have been. But every time I look at my mismatched bedroom set, I think about how this whole situation could have been avoided with one phone call. My mum has been sending me links to furniture sales and offering to help me pay for new stuff. I think she's trying to make up for what happened, but it's missing the point. It was never about the monetary value of the furniture. It was about the sentimental value and the principle of being asked before someone gives away your belongings. Last week, my cousin posted pictures on social media of her daughter's new room. The furniture looks great, and the kid is obviously happy with it. Part of me is glad it's being used and appreciated, but seeing those photos also made me sad in a way I wasn't expecting. It's like seeing a piece of your childhood living in someone else's house. That story ends there. The complete dismissal of someone's emotional attachment to their belongings is heartbreaking. Just because you're an adult doesn't mean your childhood memories become worthless, and just because something isn't currently in use doesn't mean it's available for redistribution. Some boundaries should be sacred, especially within families. Our next story takes us into the realm of social situations, where some people apparently never learned that not every event is designed with children in mind. My friend brings their kid to every event, even when it's clearly adults only. I love my friend Theo, and I think his 4-year-old is generally a sweet kid, but this situation has gotten completely out of hand, and I don't know how to address it without sounding like a terrible person. Theo became a single dad about 2 years ago when his ex moved across the country for work and decided she didn't want split custody. It was a messy situation, and I felt really bad for him, trying to navigate single parenthood while dealing with the emotional fallout of his relationship ending. All of our friend group rallied around Theo during that time. We understood that his life had changed dramatically and that he'd need to bring his kid to some gatherings that used to be adults only. Birthday parties, casual dinners, weekend barbecues, that kind of thing. We all adjusted our expectations and tried to make sure there were kid-friendly options when we knew he was coming. But somewhere along the line, Theo started bringing his child to literally everything, regardless of whether it was appropriate or not. And I mean everything. The first incident that really stood out was about a year ago. Our friend group had planned a wine tasting event at this upscale bar downtown. We'd made reservations for 8 people, specifically chose a place known for its sophisticated atmosphere and extensive wine list, and had been looking forward to it for weeks. The day of the event, Theo showed up with his kid in tow. The hostess at the bar looked confused and explained that children weren't allowed in the establishment after 9 p.m. due to their liquor license. Theo seemed genuinely surprised by this information and asked if we could move the reservation to an earlier time. We ended up having to cancel our reservation and find a family restaurant instead. The wine tasting became chicken nuggets and juice boxes, which wasn't necessarily bad, but it wasn't what any of us had planned or wanted that evening. When I gently suggested to Theo afterward that maybe he should check whether events are kid-appropriate before committing to them, he said he just assumed we'd all want to include his child in our plans. He seemed hurt that I'd even brought it up. The pattern continued from there. Game night at someone's apartment where we usually play Cards Against Humanity and drink beer. Theo would show up with his kid and we'd have to switch to Uno and keep our language in check. Happy hour after work at a sports bar. Kid comes along and we spend the evening making sure they don't wander into the kitchen or bother other customers. The breaking point for me happened 3 months ago. Another friend in our group was celebrating a promotion at work and decided to throw a party at a karaoke bar. This wasn't just any karaoke bar. This was one of those late-night places that gets pretty rowdy, serves strong drinks, and stays open until 2 a.m. The invitation specifically said the party was starting at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night. It mentioned karaoke, dancing, and celebrating until late. Every detail about this event screamed adults only. Theo showed up at 10:30 p.m. with his 4-year-old, who was already cranky and obviously should have been in bed hours ago. The music was loud, people were drinking and singing inappropriate songs, and the lighting was dim and strobing. When the birthday person saw Theo walk in with his child, I could see the panic in their eyes. This was supposed to be their big celebration, their chance to let loose with friends, and suddenly they had to worry about whether the environment was appropriate for a preschooler. I pulled Theo aside and asked what he was thinking, bringing a child to a place like this at nearly 11 p.m. He got defensive and said he didn't have a babysitter and couldn't afford to miss another social event. He said if we were really his friends, we'd understand that his kid was part of the package now. The thing is, we do understand that his kid is part of his life, but there's a difference between including a child in appropriate activities and forcing everyone else to adapt every single social gathering to accommodate a 4-year-old. The karaoke situation got worse as the night went on. The kid was tired, overwhelmed, and started having a meltdown around midnight. Theo had to leave early, but not before several other people also left because the crying child had killed the party atmosphere. After that incident, I started noticing that fewer people were inviting Theo to events. Not because they didn't like him or his kid, but because they knew that any adult-oriented activity would automatically become a child-centered activity if he came. I felt bad about this development, so I tried talking to Theo about finding a balance. I suggested that maybe he could arrange babysitting for certain events, or that we could plan some specifically kid-friendly activities alongside our usual adult gatherings. Theo's response was that he shouldn't have to choose between his child and his friends. He said that real friends would want to include his kid in everything, and that asking him to get a babysitter was the same as asking him to abandon his responsibilities as a parent. But that's not what anyone was asking. We were asking for some events to remain adult-focused, the same way they'd been before he became a parent. We were asking for balance, not abandonment. Abandonment. The situation came to a head last month when our friend group was invited to a wedding. Not Theo's wedding, not a family wedding where kids would be expected, but a formal evening wedding with a reception that explicitly said adults only on the invitation. I thought surely this would be the line Theo wouldn't cross. Wedding invitations are pretty clear about these things, and adults only doesn't leave much room for interpretation. I was wrong. Theo not only showed up to the wedding with his 4-year-old, but he seemed genuinely confused when the wedding coordinator approached him at the door. She politely explained that the couple had requested no children at the ceremony or reception and asked if he had arrangements for childcare. Theo argued with her. He said his child was well behaved and wouldn't cause any problems. He said he'd driven 2 hours to get there and couldn't just turn around and go home. He said the bride and groom should understand that he was a single parent and couldn't always find babysitters. The poor wedding coordinator was stuck in an impossible position. She had explicit instructions from the couple about no children, but she also had a wedding guest arguing with her at the door 15 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start. Eventually, Theo was allowed to stay, but I could see how uncomfortable it made everyone. The bride kept glancing over during the ceremony as the 4-year-old fidgeted and made noise. During the reception, Theo spent most of his time chasing his kid around instead of socializing, and several of the planned activities had to be modified because there was suddenly a child present. Other wedding guests were giving our whole friend group dirty looks, like we were all somehow responsible for bringing a kid to an adults-only event. It was embarrassing and frustrating, and I felt terrible for the bride and groom whose special day had been disrupted. After the wedding, I decided I had to say something. I called Theo and tried to have a calm, honest conversation about boundaries and appropriate behaviour in different social settings. I explained that while we all care about him and his child, there are some events that just aren't designed for kids. I said it wasn't about excluding them from his life, but about recognising that different activities serve different purposes. Theo got angry. He said I was being judgmental and unsupportive. He accused me of not understanding what it's like to be a single parent, and said that if I couldn't accept his child as part of every aspect of his life, then maybe we weren't as good friends as he'd thought. He said he was tired of feeling like he had to choose between being a good parent and having a social life. He said his kid was more important than any party or event, and that anyone who couldn't understand that wasn't worth his time. I tried to explain that nobody was asking him to choose between being a good parent and having friends. We were asking him to use judgment about which events were appropriate for children and which weren't. We were asking him to consider that other people might want adult conversations and activities sometimes. But Theo interpreted any request for kid-free events as an attack on his parenting and his priorities. He made it seem like wanting to occasionally have adult time was selfish and unreasonable. The conversation ended with Theo saying he didn't want to be friends with people who didn't fully accept his family situation. He said he'd rather spend his time with people who understood that his child came first in every decision. I haven't heard from him since that call 3 weeks ago. Neither have most of our other friends. It's sad because we all genuinely care about Theo and want to support him as a single parent. But we also want to be able to have age-appropriate social activities without constantly worrying about whether we're being inclusive enough. The ironic thing is that Theo's all-or-nothing approach has ended up isolating him more than if he'd just been willing to find some balance. By insisting that his child be included in everything, he's ended up being included in nothing. I keep thinking about whether there was a better way to handle this situation. Maybe I should have been more direct earlier on, or maybe I should have been more understanding about his challenges as a single parent. But I also think there has to be some middle ground between abandoning your friends and bringing a 4-year-old to a midnight karaoke party. That story is over. The complete inability to recognize that some spaces and times are designed for adults is exhausting for everyone involved. Single parenthood is challenging, but using it as a justification to ignore social boundaries ends up alienating the very people who want to support you. Sometimes the kindest thing friends can do is be honest about what works and what doesn't. Let's move into our next story, which takes us into the complicated territory of relationships and the lies we tell ourselves about trust. My partner still messages their ex after they swore they stopped. This is one of those situations where I keep going back and forth between feeling like I'm overreacting and feeling like my gut instincts are trying to tell me something important. I've been with Samir for about 8 months now. Things moved pretty quickly between us, which was actually nice after coming out of a long relationship that had dragged on way past its expiration date. Samir seemed mature, direct, ready for something serious. He talked about wanting a real partnership with someone, about being tired of games and drama. About 3 months into our relationship, Samir mentioned that his ex had reached out to him. Nothing dramatic, just a text saying she hoped he was doing well and that she'd seen something that reminded her of him. He showed me the message and asked what I thought he should do about it. I appreciated that he brought it up instead of hiding it. That felt like mature, honest communication. We talked about it and agreed that while we couldn't control who reached out to us, we could control how we responded. Samir said he didn't want any drama or confusion in his life, so he was just going to ignore the message. That seemed reasonable to me. Clean boundaries, no unnecessary communication with exes. Focus on our relationship. I felt good about how he'd handled it. A few weeks later, Samir mentioned that his ex had texted him again. This time it was something about needing to pick up some belongings she'd left at his place during their relationship. Again, he showed me the message, and we talked through how to handle it. We decided that the mature thing to do was to arrange a time for her to get her stuff so they could have closure on the practical aspects of their breakup. Samir suggested that I could be there when she came over, which I thought was considerate and transparent. The pickup went fine. She seemed nice enough, a little awkward about meeting me, but nothing weird or dramatic. She got her things. They exchanged maybe 10 words of small talk, and that was it. Samir seemed relieved to have that chapter officially closed. For a couple of months after that, the ex situation didn't come up at all. I assumed they'd had their closure and moved on. Samir and I were spending more time together, talking about future plans, getting more serious about our relationship. Then last month, I was at Samir's apartment while he was in the shower. His phone was on the kitchen counter and kept buzzing with notifications. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I could see the preview of messages on his lock screen. 3 messages from his ex. The previews were long enough that I could see they weren't just casual hellos. When Samir got out of the shower, I mentioned that his ex had been texting him. His reaction was immediate and weird. He got flustered and said it was probably nothing important, just random stuff. He grabbed his phone quickly and didn't offer to show me the messages like he had before. That change in behaviour set off alarm bells for me. If the messages were innocent, why wouldn't he show them to me like he had in the past? Why did he seem nervous about it? I asked him directly if he'd been talking to his ex regularly, and he said no, just occasional random messages that he mostly ignored. He said it wasn't worth discussing because it didn't mean anything, but something about his answer felt off. The way he avoided eye contact, the way he deflected when I asked follow-up questions. It felt like there was more to the story than he was telling me. Over the next couple of weeks, I noticed Samir being more protective of his phone. He'd take it with him to the bathroom, put it face down when we were together, step out of the room to answer texts. Small changes, but noticeable ones. I started paying attention to his mood and behaviour patterns. There were times when he'd seem distracted or distant, usually after spending time on his phone, times when he'd be less present during our conversations, like his mind was somewhere else. I didn't want to be the kind of person who goes through their partner's phone, but the suspicious behaviour was starting to affect our relationship. I found myself questioning things he said, wondering what he wasn't telling me, feeling paranoid about every text notification. Finally, last week, I decided I had to know what was going on. Samir had left his phone charging in the bedroom while he went to make coffee. I know this makes me sound terrible, but I looked at his messages. What I found was months of regular communication with his ex. Not just the occasional random text he'd described, but actual conversations. Daily good morning and good night messages, long discussions about their work and personal lives, messages about missing each other and remembering good times from their relationship. The most recent conversation had happened the night before. She'd sent him a photo of a sunset with a message about how it reminded her of a trip they'd taken together. He'd responded with heart emojis and said he remembered that trip too, that it had been perfect. Perfect. He was telling his ex that their romantic trip together had been perfect while he was in a relationship with me. There were also messages about meeting up for coffee, which apparently had happened twice in the past month, meetings that Samir had never mentioned to me, during times when he'd said he was busy with work or hanging out with friends. Reading through those messages felt like being punched in the stomach, not just because of the content, but because of how completely different they were from what Samir had been telling me. He hadn't been ignoring random messages from his ex. He'd been maintaining an active, ongoing, emotionally intimate relationship with her. When Samir came back to the bedroom, I confronted him with what I'd found. His first reaction was to be angry that I'd gone through his phone. He said I'd violated his privacy and that going through someone's messages was a huge red flag in a relationship. I told him that lying to your partner for months was an even bigger red flag. Eventually he stopped deflecting and started trying to explain. He said the messages were just innocent catching up between friends. He said he and his ex had decided to maintain a friendship after their breakup, and that he hadn't told me about it because he knew I'd overreact. Innocent catching up. Heart emojis about romantic trips and secret coffee dates are innocent catching up. I asked him how he'd feel if I'd been having daily conversations with my ex behind his back, meeting up with him secretly and lying about it for months. Samir said that was different because I didn't understand his relationship with his ex. I asked him to explain what I didn't understand. He said they'd been together for 3 years and had a deep connection that couldn't just be turned off. He said they'd decided to try being friends because they cared about each other too much to completely cut contact. He said the secrecy wasn't about hiding anything inappropriate. It was about protecting me from unnecessary jealousy and drama. He said he knew I'd be upset about their friendship, even though it was platonic. So he'd decided to keep it private to avoid conflict. But that explanation didn't match what I'd read in their messages. The tone, the content, the frequency of communication, none of it felt like just friendship. It felt like they were maintaining their emotional relationship while he was physically in a relationship with me. When I pointed this out, Samir got defensive. He said I was reading too much into innocent messages and that I was being paranoid and controlling. He said if I couldn't trust him to have friendships with people from his past, then maybe I wasn't ready for a mature relationship. That hurt. He was turning my reasonable concerns about his secretive behaviour into a character flaw on my part. He was making me feel like the problem was my insecurity, not his dishonesty. I told Samir that the issue wasn't him having friendships, it was him lying to me about the nature and extent of his communication with his ex. I said if he wanted to be friends with her, fine, but it needed to be transparent and appropriate, given that he was in a relationship with someone else. Samir said he'd try to be more open about it going forward, but that he still thought I was overreacting. He said the messages didn't mean anything, and that I was creating drama where none existed. That conversation was a week ago. Since then, I've been trying to figure out whether I should believe Samir's explanations or trust my gut feeling that something isn't right about this situation. Part of me wants to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he really was just trying to avoid conflict by keeping their friendship private. Maybe I am reading too much into messages that are innocent to most people. Maybe the heart emojis and secret meetups really were just friendship in his mind. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm being naive. The pattern of lying, the defensive reactions when I ask questions, the way he tried to make me feel crazy for having concerns about behaviour that would bother most people in relationships. I don't know if I'm dealing with someone who has poor boundaries with exes, someone who's emotionally cheating, or someone who's just really bad at honest communication. What I do know is that the foundation of trust we'd built early in our relationship feels shaky now. The worst part is that I'm starting to question everything else Samir tells me. If he could lie so easily about something this significant for months, what else might he be lying about? How do you rebuild trust when someone has shown they're comfortable with deception as a conflict avoidance strategy? We're supposed to have dinner tonight to talk more about all this. I'm hoping we can figure out a way forward that doesn't involve me constantly wondering who he's texting or where he's really going when he says he's busy with work. But honestly, I'm not sure how we come back from months of lies, even if they were supposedly well-intentioned ones. That story ends there. The casual gaslighting of making someone feel crazy for having normal concerns about secretive behaviour is infuriating. When someone says they're protecting you from drama by lying to you, they're really just protecting themselves from accountability. Trust isn't something you can rebuild with good intentions alone. Speaking of family members who think your belongings are communal property, this next story involves siblings and the clothes we never seem to get back. My brother took my hoodie, and now everyone thinks it's his. I know this sounds like such a minor thing compared to some of the stuff that gets posted online, but it's been driving me absolutely crazy for the past 2 months, and I need to vent about it somewhere. I have this really nice hoodie that I bought last year. Nothing super expensive, but it's from a brand I really like, and it fits perfectly. It's this forest green colour that goes with everything, and it's become my go-to comfort piece when I want to look casual but put together. My brother Clara is 2 years younger than me, and we've always had a decent relationship. We live in the same city, but have our own apartments, so we see each other pretty regularly for family dinners and random hangouts. We're close enough that we sometimes borrow each other's clothes for specific occasions, but we've always been good about returning things promptly. About 3 months ago, Clara was going through a rough breakup and needed some comfort clothes to lounge around in. She asked if she could borrow some of my oversized stuff to wear while she was feeling sad and didn't want to put effort into getting dressed. I let her take a few items, including my favourite green hoodie. I figured she'd have them for a week or two while she got through the worst of the emotional aftermath, then give everything back once she was feeling more like herself again. That was 3 months ago. After about 2 weeks, I texted Clara asking when she wanted to meet up so I could get my clothes back. She said she was still having a hard time and asked if she could keep them a little longer. I said sure because I wanted to be supportive and I wasn't in desperate need of the hoodie right away. But then I started seeing Clara wearing my hoodie everywhere, to the grocery store, to work, out with friends. She started posting photos on social media wearing it, and people were commenting about how good she looked in green and asking where she got such a nice hoodie. Instead of saying it was borrowed from her sister, Clara would just say thanks, or mention the brand name, like she'd bought it herself. She was getting compliments on my clothing and taking credit for my style choices. After about a month of this, I asked Clara again about getting my clothes back. She said she'd been meaning to wash everything and bring it over, but she'd been busy with work and dating again. She promised she'd drop everything off the following weekend. The following weekend came and went with no sign of my clothes. When I asked about it, Clara said she'd forgotten and would definitely do it the next weekend. This pattern continued for weeks. The breaking point came when I saw Clara at a family gathering wearing my hoodie. Not only was she wearing it to an event where I was present, but when our aunt complimented her on it, Clara launched into this whole story about how she'd found it at this cute boutique downtown, and it had been the last one in her size. I was sitting right there, listening to her make up a completely fictional shopping story about my hoodie. She was lying to our family about buying something that she'd borrowed from me months earlier and never returned. After the family dinner, I pulled Clara aside and told her I really needed my hoodie back. I mentioned that I'd noticed her wearing it a lot and that I was starting to miss having it in my wardrobe. Clara's response was to act like I was being unreasonable. She said she'd been going through a hard time and the hoodie made her feel better. She said she didn't understand why I was being so possessive about one piece of clothing when I had plenty of other things to wear. Possessive about my own hoodie that I'd lent her temporarily. I tried to explain that it wasn't about being possessive. It was about her keeping something that belonged to me for much longer than we'd agreed on. I also mentioned that I'd noticed her telling people she'd bought it, which made me uncomfortable. Clara got defensive and said she hadn't meant to imply ownership. She just didn't want to get into the whole story of borrowing it every time someone asked about it. She said it was easier to just accept compliments without explaining the situation. Easier for her, maybe, but it meant I was watching someone else get credit for something I'd chosen and purchased. I asked Clara to please bring the hoodie back within the next few days, since we'd been talking about it for months. She agreed, but seemed annoyed that I was making such a big deal out of it. A week went by with no hoodie. When I texted to ask about it, Clara said she'd been wearing it so much that it needed to be washed, and she wanted to make sure it was clean before she returned it. She said she'd bring it over once she had time to do laundry. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, Clara has continued wearing my hoodie regularly. She's posted more photos in it, gotten more compliments, and has started referring to it as her favourite piece of clothing. She's even started wearing it to places where she knows she'll see me, like family events and mutual friend gatherings. Last week, I decided to be more direct. I texted Clara and said I needed my hoodie back by the weekend, no exceptions. I said I'd been more than patient, but it was time for her to return my property. Clara's response was that she was surprised I was still thinking about it. She said she'd gotten so used to wearing the hoodie that she'd started thinking of it as hers. She suggested that maybe I could just let her keep it, since she'd clearly gotten more use out of it than I had. Let her keep it, like it was some old item I'd forgotten about, instead of a piece of clothing I'd specifically asked for back multiple times over several months. I told Clara that wasn't happening, and that I expected my hoodie back immediately. She said she'd think about it, which was such a bizarre response to someone asking for their own belongings back. 2 days ago, I saw Clara at our cousin's birthday party. She was wearing my hoodie again. When I approached her about it, she said she'd grabbed it without thinking and would definitely remember to bring it next time we saw each other. Next time. After months of promises and excuses, she was still talking about next time. I told Clara that I wanted my hoodie back before leaving the party. She said that was awkward and embarrassing, that I was making a scene over clothes. She said if it was really that important to me, I could come pick it up from her apartment during the week. But here's the thing. I shouldn't have to chase down my own belongings. I shouldn't have to make special trips to retrieve items that someone borrowed and never returned. I shouldn't have to feel like I'm being unreasonable for wanting my own clothes back. Yesterday, I went to Clara's apartment to get my hoodie. When I asked for it, she said it was in her dirty laundry and would need to be washed before I could take it. She offered to bring it to me later in the week. After she did laundry, I told her I'd take it dirty. It's my hoodie, I can wash it myself. Clara seemed offended by this. She said I was being weird and impatient, that normal people don't take back dirty clothes from family members. She said she was trying to be considerate by washing it first. Considerate. After keeping my hoodie for 3 months despite multiple requests to return it, she was worried about being considerate. I ended up leaving without the hoodie because Clara claimed she couldn't find it in her laundry pile. She promised she'd bring it to me this weekend after washing it. I don't believe her anymore. At this point, I think Clara has decided that the hoodie is hers now, and she's just going to keep making excuses until I give up asking for it back. The most frustrating part is that this has damaged our relationship over something that should have been simple. Borrowing clothes between siblings should be easy and drama-free. Instead, it's become this ongoing source of conflict, because Clara apparently thinks that borrowing something means she gets to keep it indefinitely. I'm starting to think I need to write off the hoodie as a loss and just accept that I'll never get it back, but it bothers me to reward Clara's behaviour by giving up. It also bothers me to see her wearing my clothes while acting like they belong to her. I don't know if this is worth continued conflict, or if I should just buy a new hoodie and learn not to lend Clara anything important in the future. That story ends there. 3 months of excuses, and suddenly she can't find it in her own laundry pile. The transformation from borrowing during a breakup to thinking of it as mine is classic boundary violation behaviour. Some people really will test how much they can get away with before you stop being nice about it, moving on to a tale of domestic harmony gone wrong, where clean dishes become a battleground. My roommate keeps using my dishes but never washing them. I'm starting to think some people were raised by wolves because the level of disrespect I'm dealing with here is honestly shocking. I live with my roommate Jonah in a 2-bedroom apartment that we found through a roommate matching service about 7 months ago. When we first met, he seemed normal enough. Clean, employed, said he was looking for a peaceful living situation where everyone respected each other's space and belongings. That description lasted about 2 weeks after we moved in together. The dish situation started small. I'd noticed that one of my plates was missing from the cabinet, then find it in the sink later that day, or I'd go to make coffee and discover my favourite mug was dirty and sitting on the counter. At first I figured these were just occasional lapses, the kind of minor roommate friction that works itself out over time. But it didn't work itself out. It got worse. Within a month of living together, I realised that Jonah was using my dishes almost exclusively while leaving his own set untouched in the cabinet. He'd use my plates, bowls, cups and utensils for every meal, then leave everything dirty in the sink for days at a time. The first time I brought it up, Jonah seemed genuinely surprised that it was bothering me. He said he thought we were sharing everything in the kitchen, that roommates typically use whatever dishes were convenient. He promised he'd be better about cleaning up after himself. For about a week, things improved. Jonah started washing dishes more regularly, and I thought we'd solved the problem. But then the old pattern resumed, except now he was leaving dirty dishes in the sink for even longer periods. I'd come home from work to find my entire set of dishes dirty and soaking in murky water that had been sitting there for days. My nice ceramic bowls that I'd bought specifically because I liked eating out of them were constantly unavailable to me because they were always in some stage of being dirty, soaking, or air drying on Jonah's timeline. The breaking point came about 2 months ago when I went to make myself breakfast and realised I had no clean dishes available. Every single plate, bowl, cup, and piece of silverware I owned was dirty and sitting in the sink. Some of the dishes had been there so long that food particles had hardened onto them. Meanwhile, Jonah's dish set sat pristine and unused in the cabinet. I had to hand wash my own dishes before I could eat breakfast in my own kitchen. As I was scrubbing dried food off my favourite bowl, I got increasingly frustrated about the situation. When Jonah got home that evening, I asked him why he was exclusively using my dishes while leaving his own completely clean. He said my dishes were nicer and more convenient to use. He said his were cheaper quality and he preferred the weight and size of mine. He preferred using my belongings while leaving me without access to them. I told Jonah that if he wanted to use my dishes occasionally, that was fine, but he needed to wash them immediately after use, so they'd be available when I needed them. I also suggested that maybe he should use his own dishes more often so mine weren't constantly dirty. Jonah agreed that sounded reasonable, but his behaviour didn't change. If anything, it got worse because now he seemed to be using even more of my dishes at once. I'd find evidence of multiple meals worth of my plates and bowls stacked in the sink, like he was cooking elaborate meals using exclusively my kitchen supplies. 3 weeks ago, I discovered something that made me genuinely angry. I was looking for a specific bowl that I hadn't seen in several days, thinking maybe Jonah had put it away in the wrong cabinet. I found it in the sink, but it wasn't just dirty, it was growing mould. My nice ceramic bowl, which I'd paid good money for and taken care of for years, had been sitting in the sink with food residue for so long that actual mould was growing on it. The smell was horrible, and the staining looked like it might be permanent. I confronted Jonah immediately. I showed him the mouldy bowl and asked how he could let my belongings get to that state. He looked genuinely shocked and said he hadn't realised it had been sitting there for so long. He said he'd been busy with work and had lost track of the dishes. For long enough that mould grew. Jonah offered to replace the bowl, which I appreciated, but it missed the point. The issue wasn't just one ruined dish, it was the pattern of using my belongings carelessly and leaving me to deal with the consequences. I told Jonah that going forward, he needed to either use his own dishes or wash mine immediately after use. No exceptions, no letting them sit in the sink for days. He said he understood and would do better. That conversation was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Jonah has continued using my dishes almost exclusively, and the sink situation has somehow gotten even worse. Now he's not even putting the dirty dishes in the sink. He's leaving them on counters, on the stove, sometimes even on the coffee table in the living room. Yesterday, I came home to find one of my plates sitting on the couch with dried pasta sauce stuck to it on the couch. He'd eaten dinner while watching TV and just left the dirty dish on the furniture. When I asked Jonah about the plate on the couch, he said he'd been planning to take it to the kitchen but had gotten distracted by a phone call. He acted like leaving dirty dishes on upholstered furniture was a minor oversight rather than completely gross behaviour. I'm at the point where I'm considering moving my dishes into my bedroom and only bringing them out when I need to use them. It's ridiculous that I'm even thinking about hiding my own belongings in my own apartment, but I don't know how else to ensure I have access to clean dishes when I want to eat. The worst part is that Jonah seems genuinely confused about why this bothers me so much. He acts like I'm being uptight and controlling about kitchen arrangements. He's made comments about how some people are just more relaxed about shared living spaces than others. Relaxed? Leaving mouldy dishes around the apartment and using exclusively other people's belongings is relaxed. I've started looking for a new place to live because I can't deal with this level of disrespect for my property. It's affecting my daily life in ways that seem disproportionate to the actual issue. But when you can't eat a meal without first cleaning your own dishes that someone else dirtied, it becomes a constant source of stress. Last night, I found Jonah eating cereal out of one of my bowls while standing in the kitchen. When he finished, he rinsed it briefly and put it directly back in the cabinet, still wet and with milk residue around the edges. He thought rinsing with water counted as washing. He put a dirty wet bowl back with my clean dishes. I don't know if some people genuinely don't understand basic cleanliness standards, or if Jonah just doesn't care about taking care of other people's belongings. Either way, I can't live like this much longer. That story's over. Finding mold growing in your own bowl because your roommate treats your belongings like disposable items is beyond disrespectful. The fact that he prefers using nicer dishes while refusing to take care of them shows a special kind of entitlement. Some people really do think other people exist to make their lives more convenient. Our next story takes us into the realm of privacy violations and the friends who think boundaries are just suggestions. I caught my friend going through my phone while I was in the shower. This happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm still feeling weird about it because it's such a violation of privacy, but also because of how my friend reacted when I confronted them about it. My friend Rosa and I have been close for about 3 years. We met in college and have maintained a solid friendship even after graduation. She's generally trustworthy and fun to be around, which is why what happened was so shocking to me. Rosa was staying at my apartment for the weekend because she had some interviews in my city and needed a place to crash. This is pretty normal for us. We've stayed at each other's places plenty of times without any issues or drama. On Saturday morning, I was getting ready to go out and decided to take a quick shower before we left for breakfast. I left my phone charging on my nightstand, which is something I've done hundreds of times when Rosa's been over without any problems. I was in the shower for maybe 15 minutes. When I came out, Rosa was sitting on my bed holding my phone, and she had this guilty expression on her face that immediately told me something was wrong. I asked her what she was doing with my phone, and she said she'd been trying to play music while I was in the shower. She said she couldn't find the speaker controls on her own phone and had grabbed mine to connect to my Bluetooth speaker. That explanation might have made sense except for 2 things. First, my speaker was off and not connected to anything. Second, when I looked at my phone, Rosa hadn't been in my music app. She'd been in my text messages. I could see from the timestamps that she'd been scrolling through conversations with multiple people. My messages with my boyfriend, my family group chat, even text threads with mutual friends of ours. When I pointed this out to Rosa, she got flustered and said she'd accidentally opened the messaging app while looking for music. She said she'd only glanced at a couple of messages and hadn't read anything important. But the timestamps told a different story. She'd been actively scrolling through conversations for at least 10 minutes while I was in the shower. That's not accidentally opening the wrong app. That's deliberately snooping through someone's private communications. I asked Rosa why she'd felt comfortable going through my personal messages, and she got defensive. She said I was overreacting, that friends look at each other's phones all the time, and that I shouldn't have anything to hide if I trusted her. The nothing to hide argument really bothered me. It's not about having secrets or hiding things from friends. It's about having basic privacy and trusting that people won't abuse your personal space when you're vulnerable. I told Rosa that going through someone's phone without permission was a violation of privacy, regardless of whether there was anything scandalous in there. I said I felt betrayed that she'd taken advantage of me being in the shower to snoop through my personal communications. Rosa's response was to minimize what she'd done. She said she was just curious about my life and wanted to know what I'd been up to lately. She said reading my messages was like catching up on gossip, not some major invasion of privacy. Catching up on gossip, like my private conversations with my boyfriend and family, were entertainment for her. I tried to explain that there's a difference between voluntarily sharing information with a friend and having that friend secretly read through your personal messages, even if the content wasn't particularly sensitive. The violation was in the betrayal of trust. Rosa seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset. She kept saying that she didn't see anything embarrassing or private, so no harm was done. She said if I didn't want people looking at my phone, I shouldn't leave it lying around. That victim-blaming response made me even more angry. She was suggesting that it was my fault for trusting her, not to violate my privacy, when I stepped into the shower for 15 minutes. The conversation got more tense when I asked Rosa what she'd been looking for in my messages. She said she hadn't been looking for anything specific, just scrolling around to see what was new in my life. But when I pressed her about which conversations she'd read, she mentioned specific details that she could only have known by reading pretty far back in my message history. She knew about a disagreement I'd had with my sister 2 weeks earlier, about a work situation I'd texted my mum about, even about plans my boyfriend and I had discussed privately. Rosa had spent 10 minutes systematically going through my most personal communications and absorbing details about my relationships, my family dynamics, and my private thoughts that I'd shared in confidence with other people. When I pointed out how thorough her snooping had been, Rosa finally admitted that she'd been curious about my relationship with my boyfriend. She said they'd seemed distant lately when we all hung out together, and she wanted to know if everything was okay between us. So her invasion of my privacy had been motivated by curiosity about my romantic relationship. She'd decided she had a right to know details about my personal life that I hadn't chosen to share with her. I told Rosa that if she was concerned about my relationship, she could have asked me directly instead of secretly reading my private conversations. I said that violating my privacy was not an acceptable way to satisfy her curiosity about my life. Rosa got upset and said she was just trying to be a good friend by staying informed about what was going on with me. She said she cared about me and wanted to make sure I was happy and safe in my relationship. Being a good friend by secretly reading my private messages while I showered. The rest of Rosa's visit was incredibly awkward. We went to breakfast as planned, but the dynamic between us felt completely different. I kept thinking about what she'd read in my messages and wondering what conclusions she'd drawn about my life based on information I hadn't intended to share with her. I also couldn't stop thinking about how comfortable Rosa had seemed going through my phone. This clearly wasn't something she'd done on impulse. She'd seen an opportunity when I went into the shower and had immediately decided to take advantage of it. When Rosa left on Sunday, she acted like everything was normal between us. She thanked me for letting her stay over and said she'd had a great weekend. She didn't bring up the phone incident or acknowledge that she'd done anything wrong. Since then, Rosa has been texting me like nothing happened. She sends me memes, asks about my day, makes plans for future visits. It's like she's completely forgotten about violating my privacy or has decided it wasn't a big deal, but I can't forget about it. Every time Rosa texts me now, I wonder what she's really looking for and whether she's the kind of person who respects boundaries or just pretends to when it's convenient. I haven't told Rosa that her snooping has changed how I feel about our friendship, but it has. I don't feel comfortable being as open with her anymore because I know she's willing to seek out information I haven't chosen to share. The worst part is that Rosa seems to think her curiosity justified her behaviour. She's never apologised for going through my phone, just defended her right to do it based on her concern for my well-being. I'm not sure how to move forward with this friendship. Do I confront Rosa again about the trust she violated, or do I just accept that some people don't respect boundaries and adjust my expectations accordingly? That story ends there. The casual justification of friends look at each other's phones all the time is such manipulative nonsense. Real friends don't need to snoop through your private conversations when you're in the shower. Once someone shows you they'll violate your privacy, when given the opportunity, it's hard to unsee that about them. Next up, we have a story that proves some people will literally try to steal your spotlight during your biggest moments. My cousin tried to propose at my engagement party. I'm still processing what happened because it was so inappropriate and shocking that I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering if I somehow misunderstood the situation. My fiancé and I got engaged 3 weeks ago after dating for 2 years. It was this perfect, intimate moment during a weekend trip we took to celebrate our anniversary. We decided to have an engagement party the following weekend to celebrate with family and friends. The party wasn't anything huge, Maybe 30 people in my parents' backyard. Good food, drinks, music. Just a relaxed gathering to share our happiness with the people we care about most. My mum had put a lot of effort into decorating and making everything special. My cousin Ethan was one of the first people I called after getting engaged. We've always been close, more like siblings than cousins, since we grew up. We grew up in the same neighbourhood and spent most holidays together. He seemed genuinely excited for me on the phone and said he couldn't wait to celebrate at the party. Ethan has been dating his girlfriend for about 8 months. She seems nice enough, though I don't know her super well since they've only been together since last year. He's mentioned a few times that he thinks she might be the one, but I figured he was still in that honeymoon phase where everything feels intense and permanent. The engagement party was going perfectly. People were mingling, sharing stories about my fiancé and me, giving toasts about love and future happiness. My dad had just finished this really sweet speech about watching me grow up and how proud he was to welcome my fiancé into our family. That's when Ethan stood up with his wine glass and asked for everyone's attention. I figured he was going to give a cousin toast, maybe share some embarrassing childhood memory, or joke about how he always knew I'd find someone patient enough to deal with my quirks. Instead, Ethan launched into this speech about how being at our engagement party had made him realise how much he loved his girlfriend and how he didn't want to wait any longer to start their life together. He talked about how inspiring our love story was and how it had motivated him to take the next step in his own relationship. I started getting a weird feeling in my stomach as I listened to where this was heading. The entire party had gone silent, and people were looking back and forth between Ethan and his girlfriend with confused expressions. Then Ethan pulled out a ring box. He got down on one knee right there in my parents' backyard during my engagement party and proposed to his girlfriend in front of all my family and friends. The silence that followed was deafening. His girlfriend looked shocked, my parents looked horrified, and I felt like I was watching a car accident in slow motion. Everyone at my engagement party was suddenly witnessing someone else's proposal. Ethan's girlfriend said yes because what else was she going to do with 30 people staring at her, waiting for an answer? But I could see in her face that she was mortified by the public nature of it and the inappropriate timing. After she said yes and Ethan kissed her, there was this awkward smattering of applause from people who didn't know what else to do. Then everyone started looking at me and my fiancé to gauge our reaction. I was so stunned that I couldn't even process what had just happened. My engagement party had suddenly become Ethan's proposal party, and I didn't know how to respond without looking like a terrible person. My fiancé handled it better than I did. He walked over and congratulated Ethan and his girlfriend, saying something diplomatic about how wonderful it was that love was in the air. But I could see the tension in his jaw and knew he was as upset as I was. The rest of the party felt completely surreal. People kept congratulating both couples, but the energy had completely shifted. Instead of celebrating my engagement, everyone was talking about the surprise proposal they'd just witnessed. Ethan seemed oblivious to how inappropriate what he'd done was. He was beaming and accepting congratulations like he'd planned some romantic surprise instead of hijacking someone else's celebration. His girlfriend kept apologizing to me quietly throughout the evening. She said she had no idea Ethan was planning to propose and that she was horrified it had happened at my party. I could tell she was genuinely embarrassed by the whole situation. When people started leaving, several family members pulled me aside to say they couldn't believe what had happened. My aunt said she'd never seen anything so rude in her life. My grandmother asked if Ethan had gotten permission from my parents before proposing in their backyard during my party. After everyone left, I finally had a chance to process what had happened. My engagement party, the one celebration that was supposed to be entirely about my fiancé and me, had been completely overshadowed by Ethan's impromptu proposal. The next day, I called Ethan to talk about what had happened. I tried to be diplomatic, saying that while I was happy he and his girlfriend were engaged, I felt hurt that he'd chosen my engagement party as the venue for his proposal. Ethan's response was that he'd been caught up in the moment and inspired by all the love and happiness around him. He said he hoped I could understand that sometimes love makes you do spontaneous things. Spontaneous. He'd brought a ring to my engagement party and planned a proposal speech, but he was calling it spontaneous. I told Ethan that regardless of his motivations, proposing at someone else's engagement party was inappropriate and had taken attention away from the event my parents had planned to celebrate my engagement. Ethan got defensive and said he didn't see why there couldn't be enough happiness to go around. He said family should be excited to celebrate multiple good things happening at once, and that I was being selfish by wanting all the attention for myself. Selfish. For wanting my own engagement party to be about my engagement. He also said that his girlfriend had been so happy and that the proposal had been perfect, so he didn't understand why I was trying to make him feel bad about one of the best moments of his life. I tried explaining that there were hundreds of other places and times he could have proposed that wouldn't have involved hijacking someone else's celebration. Ethan said he hadn't planned it, and that the moment had just felt right. But when I talked to his girlfriend later, she told me a different story. She said Ethan had been carrying the ring around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. She said he'd mentioned several times how romantic it would be to propose at a party surrounded by family. So it wasn't spontaneous at all. Ethan had planned to use my engagement party as the backdrop for his own proposal, probably thinking it would be more romantic and memorable than planning his own special moment. The worst part is how this has affected my relationship with Ethan. We've always been close, but now I keep wondering if he's the kind of person who thinks other people's important moments are opportunities for him to make himself the centre of attention. My parents are furious with him. My mum said she spent weeks planning every detail of my engagement party, and Ethan turned it into something completely different without asking anyone's permission. Ethan's parents have tried to smooth things over by saying he just got carried away with excitement and didn't mean any harm, but the impact was the same regardless of his intentions. When people ask me about my engagement party now, they don't talk about the beautiful decorations my mum put together or the sweet toasts people gave about my relationship. They talk about the dramatic surprise proposal that happened in the middle of it. My special celebration became a story about someone else's romantic gesture, and I'm not sure how to get past feeling robbed of that experience. That story ends there. The absolute nerve of planning to propose at someone else's engagement party and then calling it spontaneous when confronted about it. Some people really can't stand not being the centre of attention, even during celebrations that are explicitly about other people. The second-hand embarrassment for everyone who had to witness that social train wreck is overwhelming. Moving into our next story, we encounter the special kind of hurt that comes from family members who seem to have selective memory when it comes to important dates. My dad forgot my birthday, but remembered my brother's a week later. I turned 22 last month, and what happened with my birthday versus my brother's birthday has been eating at me ever since, because it perfectly illustrates a pattern I've been noticing for years. My birthday is on a Tuesday. It's not a particularly memorable date, but it's been the same date for 22 years. So it's not like it moves around or anything. I wasn't expecting some huge celebration, but I was hoping for at least acknowledgement from my immediate family. The day came and went without a word from my dad, Hugo. No phone call, no text message, no card, nothing. My mum called in the morning to wish me happy birthday. My brother sent a funny meme, but radio silence from Hugo. I figured maybe he was busy with work and would reach out later in the day. Then I thought maybe he'd call that evening after he got home. But Tuesday turned into Wednesday, and then Wednesday turned into Thursday, and still nothing. By Friday, I was starting to feel genuinely hurt. It's one thing to be late with birthday wishes. It's another thing to completely ignore the fact that your child had a birthday. I kept checking my phone, thinking maybe I'd missed a call or text somehow. Over the weekend, I saw Hugo at a family dinner, and he didn't mention my birthday at all. He talked about work, complained about traffic, asked about everyone else's week, but nothing about the fact that I'd turned 22 a few days earlier. I thought about bringing it up myself, but I shouldn't have to remind my own father that my birthday happened. If he cared enough to remember, he'd remember. If he didn't remember, then clearly it wasn't important enough to him to make an effort. My brother's birthday is exactly 1 week after mine. Same day of the week, same time of year, just 7 days later. His 24th birthday fell on the following Tuesday. Hugo called my brother first thing in the morning. Not just a quick happy birthday call, but a long conversation about his plans for the day, whether he was doing anything special to celebrate, stories about previous birthdays when he was growing up. Then Hugo took my brother out for lunch at his favourite restaurant. Just the two of them, a nice father-son birthday meal where they could catch up and celebrate another year of life. That evening, Hugo posted a long, heartfelt message on social media about my brother. Photos from when he was little, recent pictures of them together, paragraphs about how proud he was to be his father, and how excited he was to see what the next year would bring. The message got dozens of likes and comments from family members and friends. People were responding with their own memories of my brother and congratulating Hugo on raising such a great kid. I sat there reading this elaborate public birthday tribute, remembering that my own birthday a week earlier had passed without so much as a text message from the same person. The contrast was so stark that I screenshot Hugo's post, not because I wanted to start drama, but because I needed proof that I wasn't imagining the different treatment. When I saw Hugo the next weekend, he was still talking about my brother's birthday celebration, how much fun they'd had at lunch, how good it felt to spend quality time together, how he hoped they could make it a tradition to do something special every year. I finally asked Hugo if he remembered that my birthday had been the week before. He got this confused look on his face and then said, "Oh right, happy belated birthday. I've been so busy lately. Happy belated birthday." Like it was some casual oversight instead of completely forgetting one of his children's birthday while making elaborate plans for the other child's birthday 7 days later. I asked Hugo why my brother's birthday had warranted a lunch date and social media post while mine had been completely ignored. He said he didn't realise I wanted to do anything special, that I'd never mentioned wanting to celebrate. Never mentioned wanting to celebrate. Like children are supposed to request acknowledgement of their own birthdays from their parents. Hugo also said that my brother had specifically asked to go out for lunch, which was why they'd made plans. He said if I'd wanted to do something I should have spoken up. But that missed the entire point. The issue wasn't that I didn't get a free meal. The issue was that Hugo had to be reminded that my birthday had even happened, while he'd apparently been planning my brother's celebration in advance. I tried explaining this difference to Hugo, but he kept focusing on the activities rather than the attention and care behind them. He offered to take me out for a belated birthday lunch, like that would fix the feeling of being forgotten by your own parent. The lunch offer felt like a consolation prize, something he was doing because he felt guilty after being called out, not because he genuinely wanted to celebrate me or spend time with me. What really hurt was the social media aspect. Hugo had felt moved to write paragraphs about his pride and love for my brother and share it with the world, but he couldn't remember to send me a private text message on my actual birthday. I declined the belated lunch and told Hugo that the issue wasn't about activities, it was about feeling like an afterthought in his life. He seemed genuinely confused by this and said he loved both of his children equally. But love isn't just a feeling, it's also actions and attention and effort. And the evidence suggested that while Hugo might feel love for both of us, he only demonstrated it consistently for one of us. Since then, I've been paying more attention to how Hugo treats his children, and the pattern is pretty clear. My brother gets proactive attention and planning, while I get reactive responses after I bring things up. When my brother got a promotion at work, Hugo called him immediately after hearing the news to congratulate him. When I got accepted to graduate school, Hugo said, "That's nice," when my mum mentioned it during dinner. My brother gets invited to sporting events and fishing trips. I get asked if I want to come along after my brother has already been invited. It's not that Hugo is mean to me or treats me badly. It's that he seems to think of my brother first and remember me second. If I'm being honest, there's this invisible hierarchy in his mind, where my brother's needs and milestones matter more than mine. And I'm not sure if it's something he's conscious of, or if it's just how he naturally operates. What bothers me most is that Hugo genuinely seems to believe he treats us the same way. He'd be offended if someone suggested otherwise, but the evidence tells a different story, and I'm left wondering if this is just how it's always been, and I'm only noticing it now, or if it's gotten worse over the years. That story ends there. The heartbreak of realizing your parent has favorites is devastating, especially when they refuse to acknowledge it. Some people can love their children equally in theory, while showing clear preferences through their actions, and that disconnect hurts more than outright favoritism would. Our next story comes from someone who learned that shared laundry facilities bring out the absolute worst in people. Someone took my laundry out of the dryer and left it on the floor. I live in an apartment complex with communal laundry facilities in the basement. It's not ideal, but the rent is cheap, and I've mostly learned to work around the inconveniences of shared washing machines and dryers. I'm pretty considerate about laundry etiquette. I set timers on my phone so I can move my clothes as soon as cycles finish. I don't leave my stuff sitting in machines for hours like some people do. If I see someone's load is done and they're not around, I'll usually wait at least 15 or 20 minutes before I need to use the machine. Last Sunday, I started a load of laundry around 2 in the afternoon. Nothing special, just my regular weekly washing. When the washer finished, I moved everything to the dryer and set my timer for 45 minutes. I went back upstairs to my apartment and got caught up in a work project I'd been putting off all weekend. When my timer went off, I realised I'd been in this deep focus zone and actually felt productive for once. So I decided to give myself another 10 minutes to finish what I was working on. I know, 10 minutes might as well be 10 hours in communal laundry land. But I figured since it was Sunday afternoon and the laundry room had been pretty empty when I was down there, I probably had a little buffer time. When I got down to the laundry room about 55 minutes after starting the dryer, my clothes weren't in the machine anymore. The dryer was running with someone else's load inside. I looked around for my clothes, thinking maybe whoever needed the dryer had moved my stuff to another machine, or at least set it aside somewhere clean and safe. That's when I found my clothes on the floor, not neatly folded on top of a machine, not placed in a laundry basket, but scattered across the dusty basement floor like someone had just dumped them out of the dryer without any care for what they were doing. My favourite sweater was lying next to the wall where people walk. My work shirts were crumpled in a corner. My underwear and socks were mixed in with dust bunnies and whatever debris accumulates on a basement floor that dozens of people walk across every day. Some of my clothes were still damp because whoever took them out hadn't even waited for the full cycle to finish. They just wanted the machine immediately and decided my laundry was in their way. I stood there for a minute just staring at my clothes scattered on that gross floor, trying to process the level of disrespect someone had shown for my belongings. These weren't just random fabric items. They were my work clothes, my nice sweater, things I'd spent money on and took care of. Now I had to rewash everything because it had been sitting on a floor that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in months. My Sunday afternoon laundry routine had just turned into an all-day project because someone couldn't wait an extra 10 minutes for me to come get my stuff. I started gathering my clothes off the floor, and that's when I noticed a woman I'd never seen before standing by the dryer that was now running with her load. She was maybe in her 30s, wearing exercise clothes, and she was watching me pick up my scattered belongings. When our eyes met, instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, she looked annoyed, like I was inconveniencing her by cleaning up the mess she'd created. I asked her if she was the one who'd taken my clothes out of the dryer, and she said yes, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She said my time was up, and she needed to use the machine. I pointed out that my clothes were still damp, which meant the cycle hadn't finished, and asked why she'd put them on the floor instead of at least setting them on top of a machine. Her response was that there wasn't space on top of the machines, and she didn't want to spend time organising someone else's laundry. She said if I wanted my clothes treated carefully, I should have been there when the dryer finished. The casual cruelty of that response was stunning. She'd made a choice between taking 30 seconds to place my clothes somewhere clean and just dumping them on the floor, and she'd chosen the option that showed complete disregard for my belongings. I told her that 10 minutes wasn't an unreasonable delay, and that basic decency would have been to at least keep my clothes off the dirty floor. She said laundry rooms operated on a first-come, first-served basis, and that people who left their stuff unattended had to accept the consequences. She acted like throwing someone's clothes on the floor was a natural consequence of being 10 minutes late, rather than a choice she'd made to be inconsiderate. The conversation was clearly going nowhere. This woman had decided that her convenience was more important than basic respect for other people's property, and no amount of explaining was going to change her mind. I gathered up all my clothes and went back upstairs to sort through what needed to be re-washed. Pretty much everything, since I couldn't tell what had touched the floor and what hadn't, and I wasn't about to wear clothes that might have basement grime on them. As I was loading my washing machine again, I kept thinking about how this woman had looked at my scattered clothes and felt no remorse whatsoever. She'd seen the direct result of her actions and still thought I was the problem for being upset about it. The re-washing process took another 2 hours, and this time I set multiple timers and went down to the laundry room 5 minutes before each cycle ended. I wasn't taking any chances with my clothes ending up on the floor again. Over the next few days, I found myself getting angry about the incident at random moments, not just about the inconvenience of having to re-wash everything, but about the principle of it. Someone had looked at my belongings and decided they were worth so little that throwing them on a dirty floor was an acceptable solution to a minor scheduling conflict. I started asking other neighbours about their laundry room experiences, and apparently this kind of thing happens more often than I'd realised. People taking clothes out of machines and leaving them in increasingly disrespectful places depending on how annoyed they are about the delay. One neighbour told me she'd found her clothes in a garbage bag next to the dumpster because she'd been an hour late getting back to the dryer. Another said someone had taken her wet clothes out of the washer and left them in the parking lot. It's like some people view shared spaces as an opportunity to take out their frustrations on strangers without consequences. They'd never treat their own belongings this way, but someone else's clothes become fair game for whatever petty revenge they want to inflict. I've started doing laundry at different times to avoid running into that particular woman again. It's ridiculous that I'm changing my schedule to avoid someone who thinks throwing people's clothes on the floor is acceptable behaviour, but I don't want to deal with the stress of wondering what she'll do to my stuff next time. The whole experience has made me more paranoid about communal spaces in general. If someone is willing to be that disrespectful about laundry, what else are they willing to do when they think no one is watching or when they decide someone has inconvenienced them? That story ends there. Finding your clothes scattered on a dirty basement floor like garbage is the kind of disrespect that stays with you. Some people really think minor inconveniences justify treating other people's belongings like trash. The fact that she felt justified rather than embarrassed shows a special kind of selfishness. Moving on to our next tale of financial responsibility and the friends who develop selective amnesia when it comes to paying people back. I lent my friend $200 and they bought a new phone instead of paying me back. This happened about 6 weeks ago, and I'm still trying to decide whether I'm more hurt by the money situation or the betrayal of trust that came with it. My friend Kai and I have been close for about 4 years. We met through work and have maintained a solid friendship even after we both moved to different jobs. He's generally reliable and fun to hang out with, which is why I didn't hesitate when he asked for financial help. Kai called me on a Thursday evening in early November, sounding really stressed. He explained that his car had broken down and he needed it fixed immediately because he couldn't afford to miss work. The repair was going to cost around $400, but he only had $200 in his checking account. He asked if I could lend him the other $200 to cover the repair, and promised he'd pay me back as soon as he got his paycheck the following Friday. He said he was embarrassed to ask, but didn't have anyone else he could turn to for that kind of money. I felt bad for Kai and wanted to help him out. Car problems are one of those emergencies that can really mess up your life if you can't afford to fix them quickly. I transferred him the money that night and told him not to worry about paying me back right away if he needed time to get his finances sorted out. Kai was incredibly grateful and said he'd never forget that I'd helped him when he really needed it. He promised he'd have the money back to me within 2 weeks at the latest. The following Friday came and went without any mention of repayment from Kai. I didn't bring it up because I figured he might still be catching up on other bills, and I didn't want to add pressure if he was having a tough time financially. But then I started seeing Kai's social media posts about going out to restaurants and bars. Nothing super expensive, but definitely not the kind of spending someone would do if they were struggling to pay back a loan. 2 weeks after lending him the money, I casually asked Kai how he was doing financially and whether he was ready to start paying back the loan. He said things were still tight, but he'd definitely have something for me soon. That same weekend, Kai posted photos from a concert he'd attended with his girlfriend. The tickets looked like they'd been pretty expensive, based on how close their seats were to the stage. I started feeling confused about Kai's financial situation. If he could afford concert tickets and restaurant meals, why couldn't he start paying back the money he'd borrowed for an emergency car repair? 3 weeks after the loan, I decided to be more direct. I texted Kai asking when he thought he'd be able to start repaying the $200. He responded that he was still waiting for some things to settle with his budget, but that he hadn't forgotten about the debt. The next day, Kai posted photos of a brand new phone he'd just bought. Not just any phone, but the latest model that definitely cost more than $200. He was showing it off, talking about all the new features and how excited he was to finally upgrade from his old device. I stared at that post for probably 10 minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Kai had supposedly been too financially stretched to pay back a loan for an emergency car repair, but he'd somehow found the money to buy an expensive new phone. When I saw Kai in person the following week, I asked him about the phone. He said he'd gotten a good deal on it and had been planning to upgrade for months. When I pointed out that he still owed me $200, he said the phone purchase was separate from that situation. Separate. Like owing someone money doesn't affect your spending priorities at all. I asked Kai how he could justify buying a luxury item when he had an outstanding debt, with a friend who'd helped him during an emergency. He said I was making too big a deal out of it and that he'd pay me back when his financial situation improved. But his financial situation had apparently improved enough for him to spend several $100s on a phone he didn't actually need. It had just improved selectively, in a way that didn't include paying back money he'd borrowed. The conversation got tense when I suggested that maybe Kai should have paid me back before making discretionary purchases. He said he didn't think it was fair for me to try to control how he spent his money. Control how he spent his money, like asking someone to prioritize repaying a loan over buying gadgets, was some kind of overreach. Kai also said that since I'd told him not to worry about paying me back right away, he'd assumed I wasn't in a hurry to get the money back. He made it sound like my attempt to be understanding about his financial stress had given him permission to indefinitely delay repayment. That hurt because I'd been trying to be a supportive friend by not pressuring him for immediate repayment. But Kai had interpreted my kindness as an indication that the debt wasn't important or urgent. Over the next few weeks, Kai continued posting about various purchases and activities that clearly cost money: new clothes, weekend trips, expensive dinners. But whenever I brought up the loan, he'd say he was still working on getting his finances in order. The most frustrating part was that Kai seemed to have compartmentalized the debt in his mind. He could spend money freely on things he wanted, while simultaneously claiming he didn't have money to pay back what he owed. It wasn't like he was struggling to afford basic necessities. He was choosing to prioritize his wants over his obligation to repay a friend who'd helped him during an emergency. Last week, I told Kai that I needed him to start making payments on the loan, even if it was just $25 or $50 at a time. I said I understood that $200 might be difficult to pay back all at once, but that some progress would show good faith. Kai said he'd try to come up with something, but he seemed annoyed that I was bringing it up again. He made it sound like I was being impatient and unreasonable for expecting repayment after 6 weeks. Since then, Kai has been less responsive to my texts and seems to be avoiding making concrete plans to hang out. It's like he's uncomfortable around me now because of the money situation, but instead of resolving it by paying me back, he's chosen to create distance in our friendship. The irony is that if Kai had just been honest about his priorities from the beginning, I might not have lent him the money. If he'd said he wanted to buy a new phone but needed help with car repairs first, I would have understood that my loan was essentially funding his discretionary spending. But by framing the request as an emergency and then immediately using his available money for non-essential purchases, Kai showed that he'd either lied about his financial situation or didn't consider our friendship important enough to prioritize repaying the debt. I'm starting to think I'll never see that $200 again, and that this loan has basically cost me a friendship. Kai has shown me that he's willing to take advantage of my generosity and then avoid me when I expect him to follow through on his promises. That story is over. The casual way some people can ask for emergency money and then immediately blow cash on luxury items is mind-blowing. When someone shows you that your loan is less important than their new phone, they're telling you exactly how much your friendship is worth to them. Moving into our next story, where we discover that some neighbours think property lines are more like suggestions than actual boundaries. My neighbour mows half my lawn without asking. I moved into my current house about 8 months ago, and while most of my neighbours have been normal and friendly, there's one situation that's been driving me absolutely crazy since spring started. My neighbour Ivy lives in the house directly next to mine. She's probably in her 60s, retired, and seems to spend most of her free time working in her yard. Her lawn is absolutely pristine, like something you'd see in a gardening magazine. Every blade of grass is the perfect height. Her flower beds are meticulously maintained, and everything looks professionally landscaped. My yard, on the other hand, is fine but not spectacular. I keep it mowed and reasonably tidy, but I'm not trying to win any neighbourhood beautification awards. I work full-time and would rather spend my weekends relaxing than obsessing over lawn care. The boundary between our properties is pretty clear. There's a small decorative fence that runs along most of the property line, and where there isn't a fence, you can easily see where one yard ends and the other begins based on different grass types and landscaping choices. The first time I noticed something weird was in late April. I came home from work to find that my front lawn looked strange. Half of it was perfectly mowed with precise lines, while the other half was still at its normal height, waiting for me to cut it over the weekend. At first I thought maybe I was losing my mind or misremembering what my yard had looked like that morning. But when I looked more closely, I could see the exact line where someone had stopped mowing, and it ran right through the middle of my property. I figured it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a lawn service had gotten confused about which house they were supposed to be working on, or maybe someone had accidentally crossed property lines while mowing their own yard. The next weekend I mowed the rest of my lawn, so everything matched. Problem solved, or so I thought. 2 weeks later, it happened again. I came home to find half my front yard perfectly manicured and the other half still unmowed. This time I was pretty sure it wasn't an accident or a mistake. I knocked on Ivy's door and asked if she knew anything about who might be mowing part of my lawn. She smiled and said she'd been doing it because she noticed my grass was getting a little long and thought she'd help out. I thanked her for the gesture, but explained that I preferred to take care of my own yard maintenance. I said I appreciated the thought, but that I had my own schedule for lawn care and didn't need assistance. And there you have it, folks. From stolen Netflix passwords to hijacked engagement parties, from mouldy dishes to midnight karaoke crashes with toddlers in tow. These stories prove that no matter how reasonable you think you are, someone out there is ready to test every boundary you thought was sacred. Whether you're deep in a Minecraft build, tackling that work project, or just trying to get through another day, at least you know your problems probably aren't quite this wild. Thanks for sticking around for this journey through the chaos of human relationships. Sweet dreams, and remember to change your passwords. Our next story comes from someone who's dealing with a friend that has mastered the art of selective amnesia. My friend Noelle and I have been part of the same social group for about 3 years now. She's fun to be around, always knows the best places to go, and honestly makes our group outings way more interesting. But there's this one thing about her that's been driving everyone absolutely insane, and I'm not sure how much longer we can keep dealing with it. Every single time we go out to eat as a group, Noelle somehow forgets her wallet. Not sometimes, not occasionally, but literally every single time. At first, we all thought it was just bad luck, or maybe she was going through a rough patch financially. We're all friends here, so obviously we'd cover for each other when needed. The first few times it happened, she seemed genuinely embarrassed about it. She'd pat down all her pockets, dig through her purse, and apologise profusely while promising to pay us back later. We'd all chip in to cover her portion, and she'd thank us repeatedly, saying she'd get us next time. But next time never came. And the time after that, and the time after that. It's been 3 years and I can count on 0 hands the number of times Noelle has actually paid for her own meal when we're all together. She's developed this whole routine now, where she doesn't even pretend to look for her wallet anymore. She just sits there while the check comes, makes casual conversation about dessert or weekend plans, and waits for the rest of us to figure out how to split her portion. Last month we went to this nice Italian place for my birthday dinner, 8 of us total, including Noelle. The bill came to about $200, which would have been $25 each if everyone paid their fair share. But of course Noelle did her usual disappearing wallet act, so the rest of us had to cover her $40 portion on top of our own meals. The thing that really got to me was how she acted about it. No embarrassment, no apologies, no promises to pay anyone back. She just thanked us casually, like we'd held the door open for her, then immediately started talking about where we should go for drinks next. My friend Tyler pulled me aside afterward and said he'd been keeping track. In the past 6 months alone, our group has collectively paid for Noelle's meals to the tune of almost $300. That's not including drinks, tips, or the times we've covered her for movies, bowling, or other activities. But here's the really infuriating part. Noelle has money. Like, decent money. She works a good job in marketing, drives a newer car than most of us, and is constantly posting on social media about her shopping hauls and weekend trips. Just last week, she posted photos of herself at some expensive spa resort, getting massages and drinking champagne by the pool. 2 weeks ago, I decided to test something. I suggested we all meet up at this casual burger place that I knew Noelle really liked. I specifically chose somewhere inexpensive, so money wouldn't be an excuse. When she agreed to come, I made her the check came. Noelle did her usual routine point of mentioning that I was running low on cash and hoping the bill wouldn't be too crazy. Sure enough, But this time, when everyone started reaching for their wallets, I spoke up. I said, "Hey Noelle, since I mentioned I'm tight on money my portion, I'll get you back this week. Would you mind covering next time?" The look on her face was priceless the first time in months, shifting in her seat and GL. She suddenly looked uncomfortable, for she thought she had cash, but maybe left dancing around the table. She mumbled something about how her wallet in her other purse. Then she started making excuses about needing to check her bank balance, and maybe we could work something out later. The tables were turned. Within 5 minutes, she'd somehow managed to find her wallet, and pay was fascinating to watch her scramble when for her own meal, though she made a big show of counting her bills and sighing about how tight money was for everyone these days. The most ridiculous part came later that evening. I was scrolling through Instagram and saw that Noelle had posted a story from some upscale cocktail bar across town. She was with different friends, ordering what looked like expensive craft cocktails and appetizers. The timestamp showed it was less than 2 hours after she'd claimed to be broke at dinner. I showed the story to Tyler, and he just shook his head. He said he'd been thinking about having a conversation with Noelle about this whole pattern, but wasn't sure how to bring it up without causing drama in the group. The thing is, we all genuinely like Noelle as a person. She's entertaining, she's always up for an adventure, and she brings a certain energy to our group that makes everything more fun. But this wallet thing has become such a consistent issue that it's starting to affect how we plan activities. Some people in our group have started suggesting we only do things that don't involve spending money when Noelle's around. Others have proposed that we all just start Venmo requesting her for her portion after every meal, but that feels weird and confrontational, and honestly, we shouldn't have to become accountants just to hang out with a friend. Last weekend we were planning a group trip to this new restaurant everyone's been talking about. It's a bit pricey, but we figured it would be worth it for a special occasion. When someone mentioned inviting Noelle, the group chat went quiet for a while. Finally, Tyler wrote that maybe we should keep it to just the people who were definitely planning to pay their own way. It felt awful to exclude her, but at the same time, nobody wanted to get stuck with an extra $60 or $70 bill on top of their own expensive meal. The fact that we're now planning activities around Noelle's wallet amnesia shows how much this has affected our group dynamic. I keep going back and forth about whether to say something directly to her. Part of me thinks she has to know what she's doing at this point. It's been 3 years and dozens of meals. There's no way someone can be that consistently forgetful about something so important. But another part of me wonders if she's somehow convinced herself that this is just how friend groups work. Maybe she thinks we all take turns covering for each other, even though the rest of us have never once forgotten our wallets or expected others to pay our way. The weirdest thing is that she's generous in other ways. She'll offer to drive when we're all going somewhere together. She remembers everyone's birthdays and brings thoughtful gifts. She's the first person to offer emotional support when someone in the group is going through a tough time. It's like she has this blind spot specifically around paying for things when we're all together. Or maybe it's not a blind spot at all, and she's just figured out that we're all too polite to call her out on it. Either way, something has to change. Tyler suggested we all start only bringing enough cash to cover our own meals, so there's literally no way for anyone to cover someone else. But that seems extreme. And what happens if someone legitimately forgets their wallet or has a card get declined? I think the most frustrating part is that this could be solved so easily. If Noelle just acknowledged what was happening and made an effort to change, we could all move past it. But instead, she continues to act like this is perfectly normal behaviour, which makes the rest of us feel crazy for being bothered by it. That story ends there. The sheer consistency of the wallet amnesia is almost impressive in its audacity. 3 years and dozens of meals without ever paying is basically a masterclass in freeloading. The fact that she can afford spa weekends but suddenly becomes broke when the dinner check arrives shows this is definitely intentional. Speaking of people with interesting interpretations of boundaries, this next story involves someone who took property ownership into their own hands. My neighbour Ethan and I have been living next to each other for about 2 years now, and for the most part, things have been pretty peaceful. He keeps his yard neat, doesn't throw loud parties, and generally minds his own business. But last month, he did something that has me questioning everything I thought I knew about property lines and basic human decency. I came home from work on a Tuesday evening to find construction noise coming from the side of my house. When I walked around to investigate, I saw Ethan and what appeared to be a professional fence installation crew putting up a brand new 6-foot privacy fence. At first I was actually happy about it. Privacy fences make good neighbours, right? Plus his old chain link fence was pretty ugly and didn't provide much visual separation between our properties. I figured he was upgrading, and maybe the new fence would even increase both of our property values. But as I watched them work, something started to look off. The fence seemed to be positioned much closer to my house than the old one had been. I grabbed a tape measure and started checking distances from various landmarks, and that's when I realised what was happening. Ethan wasn't just replacing his fence, he was moving it, about 3 feet into my yard. The new fence was cutting off a significant portion of my side yard, including the area where I keep my garbage cans and part of my driveway. It also blocked access to my electrical meter and air conditioning unit, which were now on his side of the fence. I walked over to where Ethan was supervising the installation and politely asked him about the fence placement. He looked at me with this completely straight face and said, "What do you mean? The line was always here." I pointed out that his old fence had been 3 feet closer to his house and that this new placement was clearly on my property. He just shrugged and said, "I think you're confused about where the property line actually is. This is where it's always been." The confidence with which he said this was almost impressive. He wasn't being defensive or apologetic. He was stating it like a simple fact, as if I was the one who was mistaken about where my own property ended. I told him I'd need to check my property survey and get back to him. He said that was fine, but the fence installation was going to continue because he'd already paid for it, and the crew was on a tight schedule. That evening I dug through all my home buying paperwork and found the official property survey that had been done when I purchased the house. Sure enough, the survey clearly showed that the new fence was about 3 feet inside my property line. I made copies of the survey and went over to Ethan's house the next morning. I showed him the official documentation and pointed out exactly where the actual property line was located. I expected him to be embarrassed about the mistake and offer to move the fence. Instead, he looked at the survey for about 30 seconds, then handed it back to me and said, "I don't think this is accurate. I've been living here longer than you, and I know where the line is." I was stunned. This wasn't a matter of opinion or memory. This was an official survey done by licensed professionals, complete with precise measurements and legal descriptions. But Ethan was looking at me like I'd just shown him a crayon drawing made by a kindergartner. I explained that the survey was done when I bought the house 2 years ago, and that it was based on the original property plat from when the subdivision was built. Ethan just shook his head and said, "Well, that doesn't match what I know to be true." At this point, I was starting to get frustrated. I asked him if he had any documentation showing where he thought the property line was. He said he didn't need documentation because he'd been maintaining that area for years, and everyone knew it was his property. The conversation was going nowhere, so I told him I'd be contacting the city to have them come out and verify the property line. Ethan said that was fine with him because he was confident they'd prove him right. I called the city the next day and explained the situation. They said they could send someone out to verify the property line, but it would take a few weeks to get on their schedule. In the meantime, Ethan's fence crew finished the installation. So now I had a fence running through my yard, blocking access to parts of my own property, and a neighbour who was absolutely convinced he was in the right despite clear evidence to the contrary. The city inspector came out 3 weeks later with some kind of surveying equipment. He spent about an hour taking measurements and checking various reference points. When he was done, he confirmed what my survey had already shown. The fence was definitely on my property by almost exactly 3 feet. I was relieved to have official confirmation, but also dreading the conversation with Ethan. I walked over to his house with the inspector's report, expecting that he'd finally have to acknowledge reality. Ethan looked at the report, then looked at the inspector's business card, then looked back at me. He said, "I think there might be some mistake here. Let me get a second opinion." A second opinion on an official city property inspection. That confirmed the findings of a licensed surveyor. That was backed up by legal property records going back decades. I asked Ethan what kind of second opinion he thought would override all of this official documentation. He said he was going to hire his own surveyor to come out and check everything because he still believed the property line was where he'd put the fence. At this point, I realised I was dealing with someone who was either completely delusional or just incredibly stubborn. I told him he was welcome to hire anyone he wanted, but the fence was still on my property and needed to be moved. Ethan said he wasn't moving anything until he got his own survey done. He also mentioned that moving the fence would be expensive, and he didn't think it was fair for him to pay for it when he still believed he was right. 2 weeks later, Ethan's surveyor came out. I watched from my window as they went through the same process the city inspector had done, measuring, checking reference points, consulting maps and documents. When they were finished, I saw Ethan talking to the surveyor for a long time. From his body language, it didn't look like he was getting the news he wanted to hear. That evening, Ethan knocked on my door. He looked uncomfortable for the first time since this whole thing started. He said his surveyor had confirmed that the fence was on my property, but that he'd been acting in good faith based on what he believed to be true. I said I appreciated him acknowledging the mistake and asked when he planned to have the fence moved to the correct location. That's when his attitude shifted back to defensive. He said moving the fence would cost him thousands of dollars, and he didn't think he should have to pay for that when he hadn't intended to put it in the wrong place. He suggested we could just leave the fence where it was, and he'd pay me some kind of monthly rent for the land use. I told him that wasn't acceptable. It was my property, and I wanted full access to it. Plus, having someone else's fence on my land could create legal issues if I ever tried to sell the house. Ethan got frustrated and said he'd thought I'd be more reasonable about finding a solution that worked for both of us. He pointed out that I wasn't really using that part of my yard anyway. So what difference did it make? The difference, I explained, was that it was my property. Whether I was using it or not wasn't the point. He'd built a permanent structure on land he didn't own, without permission, and now he needed to fix it. That was 2 weeks ago, and the fence is still there. Ethan has stopped talking to me entirely, and I've started the process of contacting a lawyer to see what my options are. The most frustrating part is that this could have all been avoided if he'd just checked the property line before installing the fence, or if he'd been willing to acknowledge the mistake when I first brought it up. Instead, he doubled down on being wrong and turned a simple fix into a legal nightmare. That story comes to an end. The level of denial required to argue with multiple professional surveys and official city inspections is honestly impressive. Some people will literally hire their own experts just to prove they're wrong twice. Our third story takes us into family dynamics and the kind of gift-giving that nobody asked for. My brother Luca has always been the type of person who takes what he wants and figures out the justification later. Growing up, this usually meant borrowing my video games without asking or eating the last slice of pizza that I'd been saving. Annoying, but typical sibling stuff that you learn to live with. What he did last month, though, crossed a line that I didn't even know existed. I've been playing guitar since I was 12 years old. My parents bought me this beautiful acoustic guitar for my 13th birthday, and it's been with me through everything. High school talent shows, college dorm room jam sessions, late nights writing songs when I couldn't sleep. It's not expensive or rare, but it's mine in a way that goes beyond ownership. The guitar has stickers on it from places I've travelled, worn spots where my fingers have played the same chords thousands of times, and a small crack near the bridge that happened when I accidentally knocked it over during a particularly enthusiastic practice session sophomore year. It's got character, history, and sentimental value that you can't put a price tag on. Luca knows all of this. He's heard me play that guitar hundreds of times over the years. He's seen how much it means to me, how it's basically an extension of who I am as a person. 3 weeks ago, I went to my parents' house for Sunday dinner, like I do most weekends. I usually bring my guitar along because my mum likes when I play after we eat. It's become this nice little family tradition where we all sit around the living room and I play whatever songs people request. But when I went to my old bedroom to grab the guitar from where I always keep it, it wasn't there. I checked the closet, under the bed, even behind the dresser, in case it had somehow fallen. Nothing. I went downstairs and asked my parents if they'd seen it anywhere. They both looked confused and said they hadn't touched it. My mum suggested maybe I'd left it at my apartment and just forgotten, but I was absolutely certain I'd brought it the previous weekend and left it in my room like always. That's when Luca walked in from the kitchen. I asked him if he'd seen my guitar anywhere, and the expression that crossed his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. He got this guilty, defensive look and started with, "Oh, about that," which is never a good way to start a sentence when someone is looking for something they care about. Turns out Luca had taken my guitar, not borrowed, not asked to use temporarily, but actually taken it. He'd given it to his girlfriend Sophia, who'd apparently mentioned that she wanted to learn how to play. When I asked why he didn't just ask me first or suggest that Sophia save up to buy her own guitar, Luca said, "She needed it more than you do. You barely play it anymore." This was completely untrue. I play that guitar several times a week, and Luca knows this because I've mentioned practicing for various songs or working on new material during our conversations. But even if I never touched it, that wouldn't give him the right to give it away. I told him I wanted it back immediately. Luca said that wouldn't be fair to Sophia because she'd already started taking lessons and was getting attached to it. He suggested I could just buy another guitar since they're all basically the same anyway. The casual dismissal of something that meant so much to me was almost more hurtful than the theft itself. This wasn't just any guitar. This was my guitar, with my memories and my history attached to it. You can't just replace something like that with a trip to the music store. I explained all of this to Luca, but he seemed genuinely puzzled by why I was so upset. In his mind, he'd done a good deed by helping his girlfriend pursue a new hobby. The fact that he'd stolen my property to do it didn't seem to register as problematic. My parents, who'd been listening to this conversation with increasing disbelief, finally stepped in. My dad told Luca that he needed to get the guitar back immediately, and my mum said she couldn't believe he'd taken something so personal without asking. But Luca doubled down. He said Sophia had already fallen in love with the guitar, and it would crush her to give it up now. He offered to pay me for it instead, as if this was some kind of business transaction, rather than him stealing something irreplaceable. I told him the guitar wasn't for sale at any price, and that if he didn't get it back by the end of the week, I'd go get it myself. Luca said that would be really awkward, because Sophia didn't know he'd taken it without permission. She thought he'd owned it and had generously given it to her. So not only had he stolen my guitar, but he'd also lied to his girlfriend about where it came from. Now she was innocently attached to something that was never his to give in the first place. The whole situation was getting more complicated by the minute, but I didn't care about awkwardness or hurt feelings. I wanted my guitar back. When the week passed and Luca still hadn't returned it, I drove to his apartment. Sophia answered the door, and I could see my guitar in the background, leaning against their couch. She seemed surprised to see me and invited me in. I explained the situation as gently as I could, making it clear that this wasn't her fault and that she'd been lied to. Sophia was mortified. She immediately went to get the guitar and apologized profusely for the misunderstanding. She said Luca had told her it was an old guitar he never played anymore, and that he'd be happy to see it get some use. She'd had no idea it belonged to someone else, let alone someone who played it regularly and had deep emotional attachment to it. Sophia handed me the guitar and said she'd be having a serious conversation with Luca about honesty and respect for other people's property. She also mentioned that she'd been wondering why he couldn't answer any of her questions about the guitar's history or the meaning behind the stickers. When I got home with my guitar, I called Luca to let him know I'd retrieved it. Instead of apologizing, he was angry that I'd gone behind his back and made him look bad in front of his girlfriend. He said I could have just let Sophia keep it and bought myself a new one, and that now their relationship was strained because she was questioning his honesty about other things. Apparently, this wasn't the first time he'd been creative with the truth about where certain items in their apartment had come from. I told him that maybe this would be a good opportunity for him to reflect on why taking other people's belongings without permission is wrong, regardless of his intentions. Luca said I was being dramatic and that family should help each other out. The conversation ended with him hanging up on me, and we haven't spoken since. My parents are disappointed in his behaviour, but they're also trying to stay neutral and hope we can work things out. I have my guitar back, which is what matters most. But the whole experience has made me realise that Luca has some fundamental issues with boundaries and respect that go way beyond typical sibling rivalry. The fact that he still doesn't understand why what he did was wrong is probably the most concerning part of all. That story ends right there. The entitlement of giving away someone else's treasured possession and then getting mad when they want it back is just staggering. At least Sophia had the decency to return it immediately once she learned the truth. Speaking of people who don't understand basic respect for other people's property, our next story involves a friend who brought some unwanted chaos to someone's living space. My friend Rosa and I have known each other since college, and she's always been a bit chaotic. Not in a malicious way, just in that scattered, disorganised way where she's constantly losing her keys or showing up 20 minutes late to everything. I've always found it kind of endearing, honestly. It's part of her charm. Rosa got a puppy about 6 months ago, this adorable little golden retriever mix named Benny. She's absolutely obsessed with this dog, which I totally get. He's cute, he's friendly, and Rosa needed something positive in her life after going through a pretty rough breakup earlier this year. The problem is that Rosa seems to think everyone else should be just as excited about Benny as she is, regardless of the circumstances or setting. Last weekend, I was hosting a small dinner party at my apartment. Nothing fancy, just 6 friends getting together to try out some new recipes and catch up. I'd spent most of Saturday cleaning the place, grocery shopping, and doing meal prep. My apartment isn't huge, but I'd managed to make it look pretty nice for company. Rosa texted me, about an hour before people were supposed to arrive, asking if it was okay if she brought Benny along. I hesitated because my apartment really isn't set up for dogs. I don't have a yard and my carpet is light-coloured and shows everything. Plus, I wasn't sure how the other guests would feel about having a puppy running around during dinner. But Rosa seemed really disappointed when I expressed these concerns, and she promised that Benny would be on his best behaviour. She said he'd been doing really well with his training lately, and that she'd keep him on a leash the whole time if necessary. Against my better judgment, I said okay. Rosa has been going through a tough time lately, and I didn't want to exclude her from something she was looking forward to. I figured we could make it work for a few hours. Rosa arrived right on time for once, which should have been my first warning sign that something was off. Benny was adorable. I'll give him that. He was excited to meet everyone, and seemed friendly enough, though he was definitely more energetic than Rosa had led me to believe. For the first hour or so, things went okay. Benny wandered around saying hello to everyone, begged for scraps from the kitchen while I was cooking, and generally just added to the social atmosphere. A couple of the other guests mentioned how cute he was, but then we all sat down to eat, and that's when the problems started. Benny apparently decided that the space under my dining table was the perfect place to relieve himself. Not once, but twice. The first time, I noticed the smell, but couldn't figure out where it was coming from until Rosa casually mentioned that Benny had had a little accident. I immediately got up to clean it, but Rosa just waved her hand and said, "Don't worry about it right now, just enjoy dinner." Like having dog urine soaking into my carpet was no big deal. The second accident happened about 20 minutes later, right in the middle of my living room. This time, everyone noticed immediately. The smell was unmistakable, and poor Benny was just standing there looking confused, while a puddle formed on my light grey carpet. I expected Rosa to jump up and start cleaning, or at least apologise profusely. Instead, she looked at the mess, looked at me and said, "That's what dogs do, he's still learning." That's what dogs do, as if this was some unavoidable natural phenomenon, like rain or gravity, rather than something that could have been prevented by taking the dog outside regularly or keeping him in a more controlled environment. I got up to grab paper towels and carpet cleaner, and Rosa finally offered to help, but in the most half-hearted way possible. She held the paper towels while I did the actual cleaning, and she kept making comments about how it wasn't that bad and how the carpet would be fine. Meanwhile, our other friends were sitting at the dinner table, trying to pretend this wasn't happening, but I could tell everyone was uncomfortable. The whole atmosphere of the evening had shifted from relaxed and fun to awkward and tense. After I finished cleaning up the second mess, I suggested that maybe Rosa should take Benny outside for a walk to help him get settled. She said he'd already gone for a walk before they came over, and that he was probably just nervous in a new environment, but she didn't take him outside. She didn't put him on a leash. She just let him continue wandering around my apartment, and I spent the rest of the evening anxiously watching him and waiting for the next disaster. The third incident happened while we were having dessert. This time Benny knocked over a full glass of red wine that one of my guests had set on the coffee table. The wine went everywhere, soaking into the same section of carpet that he'd already peed on twice. At this point, I was done being polite. I told Rosa that she needed to take Benny outside, or take him home, because I couldn't deal with any more accidents in my apartment. Rosa got defensive and said I was being unfair to Benny, who was just a puppy and couldn't help it. She said if I didn't want dogs in my apartment, I should have said so from the beginning, instead of letting her bring him and then getting mad about normal puppy behaviour. I reminded her that I had expressed concerns about having a dog over, and that she'd promised he would be well behaved. 3 accidents in 2 hours didn't exactly qualify as well behaved in my book. Rosa said she thought I'd be more understanding since I knew how much Benny meant to her. She packed up her things and left early, taking Benny with her, but not before making it clear that she felt I was being unreasonable and unwelcoming. The rest of my guests stayed for another hour or so, but the mood never really recovered. Everyone was polite about it, but I could tell they felt awkward about the whole situation. One friend even offered to help me clean the carpet more thoroughly, which was sweet but also embarrassing. After everyone left, I spent 2 more hours trying to get the smell and stains out of my carpet. Even with professional-grade carpet cleaner and a rented steam cleaner, there are still faint marks where the accidents happened. The most frustrating part is that Rosa still doesn't seem to understand why I was upset. She texted me a few days later with a casual, "Hey, what's up?" as if nothing had happened. When I mentioned that I was still dealing with carpet cleaning, she said, "Oh yeah, sorry about that," in the most dismissive way possible. She hasn't offered to pay for professional cleaning, hasn't acknowledged that bringing an untrained puppy to someone else's apartment might not have been the best idea, and certainly hasn't apologised for ruining my dinner party. I love Rosa as a friend, but this whole experience has made me realise that she has some serious blind spots when it comes to taking responsibility for her choices. Bringing a puppy to someone's home is a big ask, and when that puppy causes damage, the appropriate response isn't to shrug and blame it on the dog being young. That story comes to an end. The complete lack of accountability and the "that's what dogs do" attitude would drive anyone up the wall. If you're going to bring your pet somewhere, you're responsible for whatever chaos they create. Moving on to our next tale of family boundaries, this one involves some creative interpretations of borrowing and lending. My cousin Kai called me 3 weeks ago in what sounded like a genuine panic. His voice was shaky and he was talking faster than usual, which is saying something because Kai normally talks pretty fast. He said he was in serious financial trouble and needed help. According to Kai, his car had broken down and needed major repairs that would cost about $1,500. Without his car, he couldn't get to work, and without work, he couldn't pay his rent or any of his other bills. He was looking at a domino effect that would basically destroy his financial stability. I felt terrible for him. Kai and I have always been close, and while he's made some questionable decisions over the years, he's never been the type to ask for help unless he really needed it. When family's in crisis, you help if you can, right? He asked if I could lend him the money for the car repairs, promising that he'd pay me back as soon as he got his next few paychecks. He even offered to write up some kind of informal loan agreement so I'd know he was serious about repaying it. I had the money in my savings account, money I'd been putting away for a vacation I was planning for later this year. It wasn't money I could easily afford to lose, but it also wasn't going to put me in financial hardship to lend it out temporarily. After thinking about it overnight, I decided to help him. Family is family, and if our situations were reversed, I'd hope he'd do the same for me. I transferred the $1,500 to his account and told him to pay me back whenever he could manage it. No rush. Kai was incredibly grateful. He thanked me probably 10 times during our phone conversation, promised he'd never forget this kindness, and said he'd start paying me back within a month once he got caught up on his immediate expenses. That was 3 weeks ago. 2 days after I sent him the money, I was scrolling through social media and saw that Kai had posted a photo on Instagram. It was a picture of a brand new PlayStation 5, still in the box, with a caption about how excited he was to finally get his hands on one. I stared at that post for probably 5 full minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. PlayStation 5s cost about $500, which is a significant chunk of the money I'd just lent him for emergency car repairs. My first thought was that maybe someone had given it to him as a gift. Maybe his parents or his girlfriend had surprised him with it, not knowing about his financial situation. There had to be some explanation that didn't involve him spending my loan money on video games. But the more I thought about it, the more unlikely that seemed. Kai had been dating the same girl for 2 years, and she was a grad student living on a tight budget. His parents were retired and living on a fixed income. Nobody in his immediate circle had the kind of disposable income to drop $500 on a surprise gift. I decided to call him and ask about it directly. When I brought up the Instagram post, Kai got defensive immediately. He said it wasn't any of my business how he spent his money, and that he'd gotten a good deal on the PlayStation from a friend who was selling it cheap. I pointed out that even a good deal on a PS5 would still cost a couple $100, money that he'd claimed not to have when he asked for the loan. Kai said that was different money from a side job he'd picked up, and that he was still planning to use my loan for the car repairs. But here's the thing, I drove past Kai's apartment complex the next week, and his car was sitting in the parking lot, looking exactly the same as it always had. No signs of recent repairs, no indication that he'd spent $1,500 getting it fixed. When I called him to ask about the car situation, Kai said the mechanic was still waiting for parts to come in, and that the repairs would probably happen next week. He said this with the same tone of voice he'd used to discuss what he wanted for lunch, completely casual and unconcerned. The following week I saw more social media posts from Kai, pictures of him out at restaurants, at bars with friends, buying rounds of drinks and generally living like someone who definitely wasn't in the middle of a financial crisis. I started to realise that I'd been played. When I confronted him about this pattern, Kai got angry and accused me of spying on him and trying to control how he lived his life. He said he was grateful for the loan, but that didn't mean I owned him or got to dictate his spending. I explained that I wasn't trying to control him, but that I'd lent him money for a specific emergency, and it was reasonable for me to expect that money to be used for that purpose. If he'd wanted a general loan to improve his lifestyle, that's a completely different conversation. Kai said I was being unreasonable and that he'd pay me back when he could, regardless of how he chose to spend money in the meantime. He seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset, as if borrowing money for car repairs and spending it on entertainment was perfectly normal behaviour. That conversation was 2 weeks ago, and I still haven't seen a penny of repayment. Every time I bring it up, Kai says he's still struggling financially and can't afford to pay me back yet. But his social media tells a different story, with regular posts about concerts, new clothes and dinners out. The most frustrating part is that he still maintains the fiction about his car troubles. Last week he posted about how unreliable his car has been lately and how he's thinking about getting something newer and more dependable. As if the $1,500 I gave him for repairs just vanished into thin air. I've learned an expensive lesson about lending money to family members and about trusting people's word when they claim to be in crisis. Kai may genuinely believe that he deserves to enjoy himself while owing me money, but that's not how loans work in the real world. At this point, I'm not expecting to get the money back. I'm treating it as an expensive education about my cousin's character and my own gullibility, but the next time Kai calls with a financial emergency, he'll be calling someone else. That story wraps up there. Getting a loan for car repairs and immediately buying a PlayStation is such a spectacular display of financial irresponsibility that it's almost admirable. The fact that he's still pretending to be broke while posting about his lavish lifestyle just makes it worse. Our next story takes us into the world of family celebrations and the art of stealing someone else's thunder. My sister Ivy has always had impeccable timing when it comes to making everything about herself. She's the kind of person who announces her diet changes during other people's birthday dinners and somehow manages to redirect every conversation back to her own experiences. But what she did at my graduation party last month crossed a line that I didn't even know existed. I'd been working toward my master's degree for 3 years, while juggling a full-time job and all the stress that comes with being an adult student. It wasn't easy, and there were definitely moments when I wanted to quit, but I pushed through, maintained good grades, and finally reached the finish line. My parents offered to throw me a small graduation party at their house. Nothing too fancy, just close family, and a few friends to celebrate this milestone. I was really looking forward to it because it felt like recognition for all the hard work I'd put in over the past few years. The party was going great. Everyone was mingling, the food was good, and people were actually interested in hearing about my thesis project and my plans for what comes next. About halfway through the evening, my dad asked me to say a few words to thank everyone for coming and for supporting me through school. I grabbed a glass and tapped it to get everyone's attention. I started talking about how much their encouragement had meant to me, how challenging the program had been, and how grateful I was to have reached this goal. I was maybe 2 minutes into my speech when Ivy suddenly appeared next to me. She didn't wait for me to finish. She didn't even wait for a natural pause. She just took the glass right out of my hand and announced, "Since everyone's here, I have some exciting news to share too." Before I could process what was happening, Ivy was holding up her left hand and showing off this enormous engagement ring that definitely hadn't been there earlier in the evening. Everyone immediately started gasping and congratulating her, completely forgetting that I'd been in the middle of thanking them for celebrating my graduation. The timing couldn't have been more perfect from her perspective. She had a captive audience, everyone was already in a celebratory mood, and she'd managed to become the centre of attention without having to organise her own event. I stood there holding an empty glass, watching my graduation party transform into Ivy's engagement announcement party. People were hugging her, asking to see the ring, wanting to know all the details about the proposal. My 3 years of graduate school suddenly felt like ancient history. My mum noticed what had happened and tried to redirect attention back to me, saying something about how we had 2 reasons to celebrate tonight. But the momentum had completely shifted. For the rest of the evening, conversations revolved around Ivy's wedding plans, her relationship, and her future. When I tried to finish my original speech, people were politely listening but clearly distracted. The moment had passed and everyone was much more interested in discussing wedding venues and guest lists than hearing about my thesis defense. The most frustrating part was how Ivy acted like this had all been spontaneous. She kept saying things like, "I didn't plan this, but since everyone's here." But she'd clearly been planning it. The ring was perfectly sized. She had professional photos of the proposal ready to show people, and she'd even brought printed save-the-date cards that she started handing out. After most of the guests had left, I asked Ivy why she'd chosen my graduation party as the venue for her announcement. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset about it. She said she thought I'd be happy for her, and that sharing good news with family was what parties were for. I explained that this was specifically my graduation party, organised to celebrate my accomplishment, and that her engagement announcement had completely overshadowed the reason we were all there. Ivy said I was being selfish, and that there was room for everyone to be happy at the same time. But that's not how it worked in practice. Once she made her announcement, my graduation became background noise. People stayed for another 2 hours, but they spent that time talking about her news, not mine. My parents were caught in an impossible position. They were genuinely excited about Ivy's engagement, but they were also disappointed that my celebration had been hijacked. My dad later admitted that he'd been looking forward to toasting my achievement, but the moment never felt right after Ivy's interruption. The worst part is that Ivy still doesn't understand why I'm bothered by what happened. She keeps bringing up her wedding plans in our family group chat and seems confused when I don't respond with the same enthusiasm as everyone else. She's mentioned several times that she hopes I'm not still mad about that silly thing from the party. That story ends right there. The calculated nature of bringing save the date cards to someone else's celebration shows this wasn't spontaneous at all. Some people have an incredible talent for making every moment about themselves, even when it's literally someone else's party. Our next story involves a neighbour who has some creative ideas about property management and garbage placement. My neighbour Jonas moved in about 8 months ago, and for the most part, he seemed like a decent guy. He keeps his lawn neat, doesn't blast music at weird hours, and even helped me carry groceries up my front steps one day when I was struggling with too many bags. I thought we were off to a good start as neighbours. The problem started about 2 months ago on a Sunday evening. I was getting ready for work the next morning when I looked out my window and noticed something odd. Jonas had placed his garbage cans directly in front of my garage door, completely blocking my ability to back my car out of the driveway. At first I figured it was just a mistake. Maybe he'd been rushing to get his trash out before pickup and hadn't realised where he'd placed the cans. It happens to everyone occasionally, right? I walked over and knocked on his door to let him know about the situation. Jonas answered and seemed completely unbothered when I pointed out that his garbage cans were blocking my garage. He said, "Oh yeah, I put them there because it's more convenient for the trash truck." More convenient for the trash truck. Not more convenient for him to carry them a shorter distance, but more convenient for the garbage collectors who had to drive down our street anyway. I explained that I needed to get my car out for work in the morning and asked if he could move the cans to in front of his own house. Jonas looked at me like I was being unreasonable and said, "The truck comes early, they'll be gone before you need to leave." I told him that wasn't the point and that I shouldn't have to worry about whether I could access my own garage based on his trash pickup theories. Jonas shrugged and said he'd think about it, but didn't make any move to relocate the cans that evening. The next morning, I had to walk outside at 6:30 to move his garbage cans myself before I could get my car out. They were heavy, and one of them had some kind of sticky liquid leaking from the bottom that got on my hands. Not exactly how I wanted to start my workday. I figured Jonas would realise this wasn't working and go back to putting his trash in front of his own house. But the following Sunday evening, the cans appeared in front of my garage again. This time, I was less polite about it. I went over immediately and told Jonas that he couldn't keep blocking my garage with his trash. He said he'd measured the distance from the curb to various points on the street, and that the spot in front of my garage was optimal for the truck's turning radius. Optimal for the truck's turning radius. This man had apparently conducted some kind of engineering analysis of our neighbourhood's waste management logistics and determined that my garage was the ideal location for his personal trash depot. I asked him if he'd ever considered asking me before conducting this optimization study on my property. Jonas said he didn't think it would be a problem since the cans were only there for a few hours overnight. But they weren't just there for a few hours. The trash pickup in our neighbourhood is inconsistent. Sometimes the truck comes at 7 in the morning. Sometimes it doesn't show up until late afternoon. Jonas's temporary garbage storage was potentially blocking my garage for up to 18 hours. I told him this wasn't negotiable and that he needed to find a different spot for his cans. Jonas got defensive and said I was being difficult about something that didn't really affect me that much. He pointed out that I could always park in my driveway instead of the garage if it was really such a big deal. The audacity of suggesting that I change my parking habits to accommodate his garbage placement strategy was honestly impressive. This wasn't his property. These weren't his decisions to make. And the convenience of the trash truck wasn't my responsibility. When I explained this to Jonas, he said he'd look into other options, but that he couldn't promise anything because the placement in front of my garage was really the most logical spot on the street. The most logical spot on the street happened to be the one place that caused maximum inconvenience for me, but apparently that was just coincidence. The following week, the garbage cans appeared in front of my garage again. This time, I didn't bother talking to Jonas first. I moved his cans to the curb directly in front of his own house, where they should have been in the first place. 20 minutes later, Jonas was at my door, upset that I'd moved his property without permission. I pointed out that he'd been putting his property on my side of the street without permission for weeks, but he didn't see the parallel. He said that moving someone else's garbage cans was crossing a line, and that there were better ways to handle neighbourhood disagreements. I asked him what he thought would be a better way to handle it, since talking to him directly hadn't worked. Jonas suggested we could work out some kind of schedule where I'd let him know in advance if I needed to use my garage early in the morning, and he could move the cans accordingly. Like I was supposed to coordinate my work schedule around his trash management preferences, I told him the solution was much simpler than that. He could just put his garbage cans in front of his own house like every other person on the street does, and we'd never have this problem again. But Jonas seemed genuinely convinced that his system was superior to the traditional approach, and that I was being stubborn by not embracing his innovation. He kept talking about efficiency and optimization, like we were discussing corporate logistics instead of basic neighborhood etiquette. That was 3 weeks ago, and we've been locked in this ridiculous garbage can war ever since. Every Sunday night, Jonas puts his cans in front of my garage. Every Sunday night, I move them too in front of his house. Every Monday morning, he complains about it. Last week, he even took photos of where I'd moved his cans, claiming he might need evidence if this escalated to involving the homeowners association. Evidence of what I'm not sure. That I moved garbage cans from my property to his property? The whole situation is absurd, but Jonas remains convinced that he's in the right and that I'm just being difficult about sharing community resources. Apparently, the curb in front of my garage counts as a community resource in his mind. That story comes to an end. The mental gymnastics required to believe that optimizing trash truck efficiency justifies blocking your neighbour's garage is truly spectacular. Some people will engineer elaborate justifications for the most inconsiderate behaviour. Moving on to friendship drama, this next story involves someone who made some interesting choices about wedding guest lists. My best friend Elise and I have been close since high school, which is why what happened with her wedding invitations hit me so hard. We've been through everything together over the past 12 years. Breakups, college stress, job changes, family drama, all of it. She was my maid of honour when I got married 3 years ago, and I just assumed I'd have the same role in her wedding. Elise got engaged to her longtime boyfriend Cameron about 8 months ago, and I was genuinely thrilled for them. They're perfect together, and I'd been expecting the engagement for at least a year. When she asked me to be her maid of honour, I immediately started planning bridal shower ideas and thinking about bachelor party logistics. The wedding planning process has been fun but stressful, as these things usually are. Elise is pretty particular about details, and there have been multiple venue changes, caterer switches, and guest list revisions over the past few months. I've been supportive through all of it because that's what friends do during wedding planning chaos. 3 weeks ago, Elise asked if I could come over to help her finalise the seating chart. She'd been struggling with how to arrange everyone, trying to balance family dynamics and friend groups in a way that would make the reception flow smoothly. We spread all the table assignments out on her dining room table, and I was helping her figure out which cousins could sit together without starting arguments and which college friends would get along best. It was actually kind of fun, like solving a puzzle where the pieces are people's personalities and relationship histories. That's when I saw it. Table 4, seat 6, my ex-boyfriend Derek's name, written in Elise's careful handwriting. I stared at it for probably 30 seconds before saying anything. Derek and I dated for 2 years during college, and the breakup was messy and painful. Not just for me, but for our entire friend group, because Derek had cheated on me with someone we all knew. It was this whole dramatic situation that divided people's loyalties and made social gatherings awkward for months. Elise had been incredibly supportive during that time. She'd helped me through the worst of the heartbreak, listened to me cry for hours, and even stopped hanging out with Derek for a while because she was so angry about what he'd done. She knew better than anyone how much that relationship had hurt me. I asked her why Derek's name was on the seating chart. Elise looked uncomfortable and said that Cameron had wanted to invite him because they'd stayed friends over the years, and she hadn't wanted to cause problems by saying no. But here's the thing that really bothered me. This wasn't a conversation we'd had before. Elise hadn't mentioned that Derek might be invited, hadn't asked how I'd feel about it, hadn't given me any heads up that I might be walking into my best friend's wedding and finding my cheating ex-boyfriend at table 4. I explained that seeing Derek at her wedding would be really difficult for me, especially in my role as maid of honour, where I'd be expected to smile and be gracious all evening. I asked if there was any way to uninvite him, or if she could at least seat him at a table where I wouldn't have to interact with him during the reception. Elise said she understood why I was upset, but that the invitations had already gone out, and it would be awkward to rescind Derek's invitation now. She offered to move him to a table farther from the head table, but said she couldn't uninvite him without creating drama with Cameron. I appreciated the gesture about moving his table assignment, but I was still hurt that this decision had been made without any consideration for how it might affect me. This wasn't just any wedding guest. This was someone who had significantly hurt me, and Elise knew all the details. When I brought this up, Elise got defensive and said she was trying to balance everyone's feelings, not just mine. She pointed out that Derek was Cameron's friend too, and that she couldn't make wedding decisions based solely on my comfort level. I understood that wedding guest lists are complicated, but this felt different. As her maid of honour and closest friend, I'd expected at least a conversation about it. Even if the final decision was still to invite Derek, a heads up would have been appreciated. Elise said she'd been dreading telling me about it because she knew I'd be upset, and that she'd hoped I'd be mature enough to handle being at the same event as Derek for one evening. The way she said mature enough stung, like I was being childish for having feelings about my ex's presence at her wedding. I tried to explain that this wasn't about Matt, the same room as Derek Urity, or being unable to be in. It was about feeling blindsided by discovering he'd be there, and feeling like my feelings hadn't been considered in the decision-making process. But Elise seemed to think I was making her wedding about me, and that I should be focused on celebrating her relationship rather than worrying about my own past drama. She said she'd already made accommodations by moving his table, and that she hoped I could just enjoy the day without letting Derek's presence ruin it. The conversation ended with both of us frustrated and hurt. Elise felt like I was being unreasonable about her guest list choices, and I felt like my best friend had prioritised avoiding an awkward conversation with her fiancé over considering my feelings. Since then, our interactions have been strained. We're still going through the motions of wedding planning, but there's this underlying tension that wasn't there before. Elise keeps making comments about hoping everyone can just get along and enjoy themselves, which feels like subtle pressure for me to pretend I'm fine with the Derek situation. The wedding is in 6 weeks and I'm dreading it. Not because I can't handle seeing Derek, but because the whole situation has changed how I feel about my role in Elise's special day. Instead of feeling honoured to be her maid of honour, I feel like an inconvenience she has to manage. That story reaches its end there. Finding out your cheating ex will be at your best friend's wedding by accidentally seeing his name on the seating chart is such a gut punch. The mature enough comment just adds insult to injury when you're trying to express legitimate feelings about being blindsided. Our next story takes us into roommate territory and the mysterious case of the disappearing food. My roommate Hugo and I have been living together for about 10 months now, and up until recently, I thought we had a pretty good arrangement. We found each other through a roommate matching app, split all the bills evenly, and generally respect each other's space and schedules. He works in tech, I work in marketing, and our different work schedules mean we don't get in each other's way too much. The issue started about 3 months ago, when I began noticing that food I'd bought for myself was disappearing from our shared refrigerator. Not everything, just specific items that I'd been looking forward to eating. A container of leftover pasta from my favourite restaurant, a yogurt I'd bought for breakfast, half a sandwich I'd saved from lunch. At first I thought I was just being forgetful. Maybe I'd eaten those things and somehow forgotten about it. Or maybe I'd miscounted how much food I'd brought home. It's easy to lose track of what's in the fridge when you're busy with work and social commitments. But then it started happening more frequently, and with items I was absolutely certain I hadn't touched, like the expensive cheese I'd bought for a recipe I was planning to make that weekend, or the leftover Chinese food that I'd specifically saved for dinner the next day. I started paying closer attention to what I was putting in the refrigerator and what was still there when I went to look for it. Sure enough, things were disappearing regularly. Not everything I bought, but enough that it was becoming noticeable and frustrating. The first time I brought it up with Hugo, I tried to be casual about it. I mentioned that some of my food seemed to be going missing and asked if he'd accidentally eaten anything that belonged to me. Hugo looked genuinely confused and said he hadn't touched any of my food. He suggested that maybe I was eating more than I realised, or that perhaps some items had gone bad and I'd thrown them away without remembering. He was so matter-of-fact about it that I started to doubt my own memory again. But the disappearances continued, and they were getting more obvious. The breaking point came when an entire leftover pizza vanished overnight. Not just a slice or two, the entire remaining half of a large pizza that I'd been planning to eat for lunch the next day. When I asked Hugo about it the next morning, he gave me the same confused expression and said, "Are you sure you didn't eat it last night? Maybe you had late-night munchies and forgot about it." Late-night munchies that caused me to consume 4 slices of pizza without any memory of it. That seemed unlikely, but Hugo was so confident in his theory that I started to wonder if I was having some kind of weird memory issues. I decided to start taking photos of my food before I put it in the refrigerator, just to have some kind of record of what I'd actually purchased and stored. It sounds paranoid, but I needed to know whether I was losing my mind or if something else was going on. The photos confirmed what I'd suspected. Items were definitely disappearing, and it wasn't because I was eating them and forgetting about it. Armed with this evidence, I approached Hugo again. This time, I showed him the photos and the timeline of when things had gone missing. I expected him to be surprised and maybe offer to help figure out what was happening. Instead, Hugo looked at the photos and said, "These don't really prove anything. You could have taken these pictures after you'd already eaten some of the food." The suggestion that I was creating fake evidence of my own food disappearing was so absurd that I didn't know how to respond. Why would I take photos of food and then lie about eating it? What possible motivation would I have for gaslighting myself? When I pointed this out, Hugo said he wasn't accusing me of lying, but that memory is unreliable, and sometimes people convince themselves that things happened differently than they actually did. He recommended that I start keeping a food journal to track my eating habits more carefully. A food journal? To help me remember whether I'd eaten my own leftovers? The whole conversation was surreal. Hugo was so calm and reasonable sounding, while suggesting that I was either lying or having serious memory problems. He made it seem like my concern about missing food was some kind of psychological issue, rather than a straightforward roommate problem. After that conversation, I started being more strategic about how I stored my food. I put my name on containers, moved things to less obvious spots in the refrigerator, and even started keeping some items in my room instead of the shared kitchen space. But the disappearances continued. Even items with my name clearly written on them would vanish. And when I'd ask Hugo about it, he'd give me the same confused look and suggest that I must have moved them somewhere else and forgotten about it. Last week, I decided to test the situation more directly. I bought a very distinctive dessert, took a photo of it, and put it in the refrigerator with a note that had my name and the date on it. The next morning, it was gone. When I showed Hugo the photo and asked about the missing dessert, he said, "Oh, that thing. I thought it was old and threw it away. It looked like it had been there for weeks." Finally, an admission that he'd interacted with my food. But his explanation made no sense. The dessert had been fresh, it was clearly labelled, and it had only been in the refrigerator for one day. I pointed out these inconsistencies, and Hugo said he must have been mistaken about how long it had been there, but that he'd been trying to help keep our refrigerator clean. He apologised for throwing away something that belonged to me, but in a way that made it sound like an innocent mistake. But this wasn't the first time food had disappeared, and throwing away something that was clearly labelled and obviously fresh wasn't the behaviour of someone trying to be helpful. It was the behaviour of someone who'd been caught and needed to come up with an explanation quickly. Since then, Hugo has been more careful, but I still occasionally find that things have gone missing. When I bring it up, he always has some explanation that makes it sound like either an accident or my own mistake, but the pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. The most frustrating part is how he's managed to make me feel like I'm the one with the problem. Every conversation about missing food turns into a discussion about my memory, my eating habits, or my ability to keep track of my own belongings. I'm looking for a new living situation, but lease agreements and deposits make it complicated to move quickly. Until then, I'm stuck living with someone who eats my food, and then convinces me that I'm imagining the whole thing. That story comes to its conclusion. The gaslighting aspect makes this so much worse than simple food theft. Making someone question their own memory and sanity over stolen leftovers is genuinely manipulative behaviour that goes way beyond normal roommate conflicts. Moving into family holiday drama, our next story involves some unexpected additions to traditional celebrations. My dad and I have always been close, especially since my mum passed away 6 years ago. It's been just the two of us navigating holidays, birthdays, and family traditions that used to include 3 people. We've developed our own rhythm over the years, and honestly, our little duo has worked pretty well. Christmas has always been our biggest celebration. We do the whole thing: elaborate dinner, gift exchange, watching old movies until way too late. It's become this sacred tradition that helps us feel connected to Mum's memory while still enjoying the holiday together. 3 weeks before Christmas this year, Dad casually mentioned over dinner that he'd been seeing someone. Her name is Mira, she works at the bank downtown, and they'd been dating for about 4 months. I was surprised he hadn't mentioned her before, but I was also happy for him. Dad deserves companionship, and I'd been worried he was getting too isolated. I asked if I'd get to meet Mira soon. Maybe we could all grab dinner sometime after the holidays. Dad smiled and said, "Actually, I invited her to join us for Christmas dinner. I hope that's okay." My stomach dropped. Christmas dinner. The most important family tradition we had. The one day of the year that was specifically about honouring Mum's memory and maintaining our connection to her. And he'd invited a complete stranger to join us without asking me first. I tried to stay calm and explained that Christmas was really important to me as our family time, and that maybe it would be better if I met Mira in a less emotionally charged setting first. Dad looked disappointed and said he'd already invited her, and that it would be awkward to uninvite her now. But here's what really bothered me. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. Dad had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. He'd thought about it, decided it was what he wanted to do, and then presented it to me as a done deal rather than something we could discuss together. When I pointed this out, Dad said he didn't think it would be such a big deal, and that Mira was excited to meet me and be part of our Christmas celebration. He made it sound like I was being unreasonable for not immediately embracing this change, to our most sacred family tradition. I asked if we could at least compromise and have Mira join us for dessert, or maybe come over earlier in the day, but keep the actual dinner as just the two of us. Dad said that would make Mira feel excluded and unwelcome, and that wasn't the impression he wanted to give about our family. Our family. Like this woman he'd been secretly dating for 4 months was already part of our family unit. Christmas morning arrived, and I was still feeling unsettled about the whole situation. I'd bought Mira a small gift because I didn't want to seem rude, but I was dreading this disruption to our established routine. Mira showed up right on time, carrying what looked like professionally wrapped presents for both Dad and me. She was perfectly pleasant, complimented our house, and seemed genuinely excited to be included in our celebration. But that was part of what made it so jarring. She acted like she'd been part of our Christmas tradition for years, commenting on our decorations and asking about the history behind various ornaments. She even brought ingredients to make her grandmother's famous stuffing recipe, as if she was contributing to a family tradition she'd never been part of before. Throughout dinner, Mira kept making references to future Christmases and how much she was looking forward to making this an annual tradition. She talked about recipes she wanted to try next year and decorating ideas she had for our house. I found myself feeling protective of our traditions and my mum's memory in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't about Mira being a bad person. She was actually quite lovely. But her presence changed the entire dynamic of our holiday in ways that felt permanent and irreversible. Dad was clearly happy to have her there, and I could see how much her enthusiasm meant to him. But every time she made a suggestion about next year or our family Christmas, I felt like our original family unit was being erased and replaced with something completely different. After dinner, when we were exchanging gifts, Mira gave me this beautiful photo album filled with pictures of Dad and me that she'd apparently collected from his house. She said she wanted to contribute to preserving our family memories and thought this would be a meaningful gift. The gesture was thoughtful, but it also felt presumptuous. She'd gone through our personal photos and created something that looked like it came from a family member I'd known for years, not someone I was meeting for the first time. When I thanked her for the gift, Mira said she hoped we could start creating new memories together, and that she was so grateful Dad had welcomed her into our family Christmas. The way she said our family made it clear she already considered herself a permanent part of our holiday tradition. Later that evening, after Mira had gone home, Dad asked how I thought the day had gone. I tried to be diplomatic and said she seemed nice, but that I wished we'd talked more about including her before it happened. Dad said he understood my concerns, but that he hoped I'd be more open to having Mira join us for future holidays. He pointed out how much effort she'd put into making the day special, and how happy it made him to share our traditions with someone he cared about. I realised that this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. Dad had made a decision about the future of our family celebrations, and my comfort level wasn't really part of the equation. Mira was going to be a permanent part of our Christmases going forward, whether I was ready for that change or not. That story ends there. The complete overhaul of sacred family traditions, without any discussion, is rough enough. But having someone act like they've always been part of the family on their first visit adds another layer of discomfort. Our next story involves someone who took landscaping initiatives into their own hands. My neighbour Theo has lived next to me for about 3 years, and we've always had a perfectly cordial relationship. We wave when we see each other, make small talk about the weather when we're both getting our mail, and generally coexist peacefully in our suburban neighbourhood. Theo takes great pride in his yard. He's got this perfectly manicured lawn, elaborate flower beds, and trees that are pruned with almost surgical precision. His property always looks like something out of a home and garden magazine, which I actually appreciate because it probably helps both our property values. My yard, on the other hand, is functional but not particularly impressive. I keep the grass cut and the weeds under control, but I'm not winning any landscaping awards. I work long hours and travel frequently for my job, so yard maintenance isn't exactly my top priority. Last Saturday morning, I was having coffee on my back patio when I noticed Theo in his yard, with what appeared to be a small tree and a shovel. He was measuring distances between various points in his garden and consulting what looked like a detailed landscaping plan. I figured he was planning another addition to his already elaborate yard design, so I didn't think much of it. Theo's always working on some kind of improvement project, and his attention to detail is honestly impressive, even if it's not my style. About an hour later, I heard digging sounds coming from the side of my house. When I walked around to investigate, I found Theo about 3 feet inside my property line, digging a hole for what appeared to be a fairly substantial maple tree. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My neighbour was in my yard, digging a hole, apparently preparing to plant a tree, without having mentioned this project to me at any point. I approached Theo and asked what he was doing. He looked up from his digging and smiled, saying, "I'm planting this beautiful red maple for you. It's going to provide wonderful shade for your patio in a few years." For me, like this was some kind of surprise gift that I should be grateful to receive. I explained that while I appreciated the thought, I hadn't asked him to plant anything in my yard, and that I'd prefer to make my own decisions about landscaping changes to my property. Theo seemed genuinely puzzled by my reaction. He said the tree was a high-quality specimen that he'd selected specifically for my soil conditions and the amount of sunlight that area receives. He'd done research on the best varieties for our climate and had even paid extra for a tree that was already several years old. But none of that changed the fact that he was making permanent alterations to my property without permission. I told him I needed him to stop digging and remove the tree from my yard. Theo set down his shovel and looked at me like I was being unreasonable. He said, "You'll thank me in 5 years when this tree is providing beautiful shade and increasing your property value. I'm doing you a favour here, a favour that I hadn't asked for and didn't want." I explained that even if his intentions were good, I couldn't have him making landscaping decisions for my property. What if I had plans for that area? What if I was allergic to maple trees? What if I just didn't want a tree in that specific location? Theo waved off these concerns and said he'd chosen the location carefully to maximise the benefits for both of our properties. The tree would provide shade for my patio while also blocking an unsightly view of the neighbour's shed on the other side. He'd apparently conducted a comprehensive analysis of my property's landscaping needs and determined that this tree was exactly what my yard was missing. The fact that he'd never asked for my input on this analysis didn't seem to occur to him as problematic. When I continued to insist that he couldn't plant the tree without my permission, Theo got frustrated. He said he'd already invested money in purchasing a quality tree and had spent time researching the best placement for it. He didn't want to waste all that effort just because I was being stubborn about accepting help. Help that I hadn't requested, and that involved permanent changes to my property. I told Theo that regardless of his intentions or his investment, he couldn't plant anything in my yard without my consent. Theo argued that property lines were just arbitrary boundaries and that neighbours should work together to improve the overall aesthetic of the neighbourhood. He said my reluctance to accept his gift was selfish and short-sighted. I pointed out that property lines aren't arbitrary, they're legal boundaries that exist for exactly this reason. Just because he thought my yard would look better with a maple tree didn't give him the right to plant one without asking. The conversation was getting heated, so I told Theo he had until the end of the day to remove the tree and fill in the hole he'd dug. If he didn't, I'd be contacting the city about unauthorized landscaping on my property. Theo said I was being ungrateful and that most people would be thrilled to have a neighbour who cared enough to improve their property for free. He gathered up his tools and left the partially dug hole and tree exactly where they were. When I checked the next morning, the tree was gone, but the hole remained. There's now a 3-foot diameter crater in my side yard that I'll need to fill in myself, since Theo apparently felt that cleaning up after his unauthorized landscaping project wasn't his responsibility. We haven't spoken since the incident, but I've noticed him giving me cold looks when we cross paths in the neighbourhood. Apparently, Refusing to let him plant unwanted vegetation in my yard has made me the villain in this situation. That story concludes right there. The confidence required to start digging holes in someone else's yard because you've decided they need better landscaping is truly something special. At least he took the tree with him when he left. Moving on to transportation troubles, our next story involves some unauthorized vehicle borrowing. My friend Juliet and I have been close since college, and she's always been a bit scattered when it comes to planning and organization. She's the type of person who forgets to renew her car registration until she gets pulled over, or realizes she needs to be somewhere important right as she's supposed to be leaving. Usually this just means she's chronically running late, or occasionally needs to borrow small amounts of cash when she realizes she forgot her wallet. Mildly annoying but harmless personality quirks that I've learned to work around over the years of our friendship. Last month we met up for brunch at this place downtown that we've been wanting to try. I drove separately because I had errands to run afterward, and we spent a couple hours catching up over mimosas and overpriced egg dishes. When it was time to leave, we walked out to the parking lot together. Juliet started patting down her pockets and digging through her purse with increasing panic, muttering about her car keys. After a few minutes of frantic searching, she remembered that she'd driven her roommate's car to brunch because her own car was in the shop. But she'd somehow managed to grab her own keys instead of her roommate's keys when she left their apartment that morning. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens to Juliet regularly, so I wasn't surprised. I offered to give her a ride home so she could get the correct keys and come back for the car later. But Juliet said her roommate was at work and wouldn't be home for several hours, and she had appointments that afternoon that she couldn't miss. She looked at my car keys in my hand and asked if she could borrow my car for a few hours. I hesitated because lending out your car is always risky, but Juliet seemed genuinely stressed about her situation. She promised to be super careful, said she'd fill up my gas tank, and swore she'd have it back to me by evening. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Juliet was incredibly grateful, promised to text me updates throughout the afternoon, and drove off in my car while I called a rideshare to get home. She kept her promise about staying in touch, sending me photos of where she'd parked at various stops and thanking me repeatedly for saving her day. When she returned the car that evening, she'd indeed filled up the gas tank and even had it washed, which I appreciated. I thought that was the end of it, until I got a parking ticket in the mail 2 weeks later. The ticket was for parking in a no parking zone downtown, in an area I'd never been to, on the exact day that Juliet had borrowed my car. The fine was $85, and the photo attached to the citation clearly showed my license plate. I called Juliet immediately to ask about it. She seemed genuinely confused at first, saying she'd been careful about where she parked and hadn't gotten any tickets. But when I described the location and timestamp on the citation, she suddenly remembered. Juliet said she'd stopped by her friend's apartment building to pick up something, and that the only available parking spot was in a 15-minute loading zone. She figured she'd be quick enough that it wouldn't be a problem, but apparently a parking enforcement officer had come by while she was inside. She apologized for the inconvenience and said she'd totally pay the fine since it was her mistake. I was annoyed about the situation, but appreciated that she was taking responsibility for it. But when I asked her to send me the money for the ticket, Juliet said she was a bit tight on cash that week, and asked if she could pay me back over the next month or two. She promised she'd get me the money as soon as possible. That was 6 weeks ago, and I still haven't seen a penny of reimbursement. Every time I bring up the parking ticket, Juliet says she's still struggling financially and asks if I can give her a little more time. Meanwhile, her social media is filled with posts about concerts she's attended, new clothes she's bought, and weekend trips to wine country. She's clearly not as financially strapped as she claims to be when it comes to paying me back. The most frustrating part isn't even the money, though $85 isn't insignificant. It's the principle of the situation. Juliet borrowed my car, made a decision that resulted in a fine, and now seems to think that paying the consequences is optional. When I pointed out that I wouldn't have gotten the ticket if I hadn't loaned her my car, Juliet said she understood my frustration, but that parking tickets were just a risk of driving in the city, And these things happen to everyone sometimes. But this didn't happen to me. This happened to her while she was using my car, and now I'm stuck dealing with the financial consequences of her poor parking choices. Last week, I finally told Juliet that our friendship was feeling pretty one-sided when it came to taking responsibility for mistakes. She got defensive and said she'd already apologized for the parking ticket multiple times, and that she didn't understand why I was still upset about it. She seemed to think that apologizing was equivalent to actually fixing the problem, and that I should just accept the financial loss as part of being a good friend who helps people out when they need it. I explained that being a good friend doesn't mean absorbing the costs of someone else's mistakes, especially when they have the money to pay for those mistakes, but are choosing to spend it on entertainment instead. Juliet said she'd try to get me the money soon, but her tone suggested she thought I was being petty for continuing to bring it up. Like I was supposed to just write off the $85 and pretend it never happened. That story reaches its end there. Getting a parking ticket because you let someone borrow your car is bad enough, but having them act like paying the fine is optional really takes it to another level. Some people treat apologies like their legal currency. Our next story takes us into the world of religious ceremonies and family commentary that nobody requested. My wife and I recently had our first child, a beautiful baby boy we named Theodore. After my grandfather, who passed away when I was young but left a lasting impact on our family. The name has deep meaning for us, representing strength, tradition, and connection to our family history. We decided to have Theodore baptized at the church where my wife and I were married, surrounded by close family and friends. It was supposed to be this beautiful, sacred ceremony marking our son's entry into our faith community and celebrating this important milestone in his young life. My Aunt Samir has always been opinionated about everything, from politics to parenting to interior decorating choices. She's the type of person who has strong opinions about decisions that don't affect her in any way, and she's never been shy about sharing those opinions, whether people want to hear them or not. The baptism ceremony was going perfectly. Theodore was calm and content. The pastor was delivering a lovely message about family and faith, and our relatives were taking photos and looking appropriately reverent for the occasion. When the pastor announced Theodore's full name as part of the blessing, I noticed my aunt shift in her pew and make a face like she'd tasted something sour. But I figured she was just adjusting her position or reacting to something unrelated to the ceremony. After the official blessing was complete, there's always this moment where family members come forward to congratulate the parents and meet the newly baptized baby. It's usually a sweet time of hugs, photos, and quiet conversations about how beautiful the ceremony was. My aunt was one of the first people to approach us, and I expected the usual congratulations and comments about how well-behaved Theodore had been during the service. Instead, she looked down at my son and said in a voice loud enough for half the congregation to hear, "Theodore, really? That's such an old-fashioned name. Are you trying to turn him into an old man before he's even learned to walk?" Or the silence that followed was deafening. Everyone within earshot turned to stare at us, and I could see other family members exchanging uncomfortable glances. This was supposed to be a moment of celebration and blessing, and my aunt had just turned it into a public critique of our parenting choices. I was so shocked that I couldn't immediately respond. Who criticizes a baby's name during their baptism ceremony, in front of the entire congregation, while the child is literally being welcomed into the faith community? My wife recovered faster than I did, and said politely that we loved the name Theodore and felt it was perfect for our son. But you could hear the hurt in her voice, and I could see she was fighting back tears. My aunt continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that everyone was staring at her in horror. She said, "I just think you should consider what the other kids are going to say when he gets to school. Theodore sounds like someone's great-grandfather, not a little boy who wants to play soccer and make friends." At this point, other family members started trying to redirect the conversation. My mother stepped in and said something about how meaningful family names are, and my father suggested we should all move to the reception area for refreshments. But my aunt wasn't finished. She said, "I'm just saying, there are so many nice, modern names you could have chosen. Something that would help him fit in better with kids his own age. Theodore is going to sound so out of place on a playground." The pastor, who had been standing nearby greeting other families, noticed the tension and approached our group. He made some diplomatic comment about how all names are beautiful when they're chosen with love, but I could tell he was uncomfortable with the disruption to what should have been a peaceful ceremony. My wife excused herself and walked outside with Theodore, and I could see she was finally letting herself cry. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of our early parenthood, and my aunt had managed to turn it into a source of stress and embarrassment. I followed my wife outside and found her sitting on a bench, holding Theodore and trying to compose herself. She said she couldn't believe that someone would choose a baptism ceremony as the appropriate time and place to criticize our choice of name for our son. When we came back inside, my aunt approached us again. I thought maybe she was coming over to apologize for her inappropriate comments, but instead she doubled down. She said she hoped we'd really think about what she'd said, because it wasn't too late to use Theodore as a middle name and choose something more contemporary for everyday use. She suggested we could call him Tyler or Tommy or some other name that starts with T, so we wouldn't have to completely abandon the Theodore idea, but could give him something more modern for school and social situations. I finally found my voice and told my aunt that Theodore was our son's name. Period. We'd chosen it carefully, it had deep family significance, and we weren't interested in her suggestions for alternatives. My aunt looked offended that I wasn't grateful for her unsolicited parenting advice. She said she was only trying to help us avoid problems later on, and that we shouldn't be so sensitive about constructive feedback from family members who care about Theodore's future. Constructive feedback about our newborn's name, delivered publicly during his baptism ceremony. That's definitely not how most people would define constructive or appropriate. The reception afterward was awkward, with people clearly wanting to celebrate Theodore's baptism, but not knowing how to address what had happened during the ceremony. Several relatives quietly apologized to us for my aunt's behavior, but the damage to what should have been a perfect day had already been done. When we got home, my wife said she felt like my aunt had stolen something from us that we couldn't get back. You only get one baptism ceremony for your first child, and instead of remembering the pastor's beautiful words and the joy on our family's faces, we'd always remember the moment when my aunt decided to publicly critique our parenting choices. That story comes to an end. Using a baby's baptism as your platform for name criticism is such a spectacular display of poor timing and worse manners. Some moments are meant to be about celebration, not unsolicited parenting advice. Our next story involves technology and the interesting ways people define privacy in relationships. My girlfriend Clara and I have been together for about 18 months now, and overall, our relationship has been really solid. We communicate well, share similar values, and genuinely enjoy spending time together. But there's one issue that's been bothering me more and more lately, and I can't decide if I'm being paranoid or if my concerns are legitimate. Clara is extremely protective of her phone, not just private, but actively secretive in ways that feel unusual for someone in a committed relationship. When we first started dating, I didn't think much about her phone habits. Everyone deserves privacy, and I'm not the type of person who needs to know every detail of my partner's digital communications. I have my own friends, my own conversations, and my own social media accounts that are mine to manage. But over time, I've noticed patterns in Clara's behaviour that seem to go beyond normal privacy preferences. She never leaves her phone unattended when I'm around. If she needs to use the bathroom, take a shower, or even just walk to the kitchen for a glass of water, her phone comes with her, always. When we're watching movies together, she'll hold her phone face down on her lap, even when she's not actively using it. If it buzzes with notifications, she'll quickly flip it over to check the screen. but in a way that makes it impossible for me to accidentally see anything. If someone calls while we're together, Clara will either decline the call immediately or step into another room to take it. Even calls that seem completely innocent, like her mum or her sister, are taken in private. The most noticeable thing is how she reacts when her phone notifications go off. There's this immediate tension in her body language, like she's been caught doing something wrong. She'll quickly grab the phone, check whatever message she received, and then seem relieved or sometimes worried, depending on what she saw. When I've casually mentioned these observations, Clara gets defensive and says she just values her privacy. She points out that I don't need to know about every text message she receives or every phone call she makes. She's absolutely right about that. But there's a difference between maintaining healthy privacy boundaries and acting like your phone contains state secrets that could endanger national security if your boyfriend accidentally glimpsed the screen. A few weeks ago, we were making dinner together when Clara's phone started ringing from the counter where she'd set it down. She was in the middle of chopping vegetables, her hands were covered in food, and the phone was right next to where I was standing. I reached over to hand it to her, not to answer it or look at it, just to pass it over so she could decide whether to take the call. The moment my fingers touched her phone, Clara practically lunged across the kitchen to grab it away from me. She said, "I've got it," in this sharp tone that suggested I'd just tried to access classified information rather than helpfully hand her a ringing phone. When I asked why she'd her a ringing phone, she declined the call without even looking at who was calling, then immediately changed the subject to what we were making for dessert. Later that evening, I brought up the incident and asked why she'd reacted so strongly to me simply touching her phone. Clara said she didn't like other people handling her personal devices and that it was just a reflex to grab it when someone else reached for it. But the explanation didn't match the intensity of her reaction. This wasn't someone protecting their personal space. This was someone who was genuinely panicked at the thought of me having access to her phone for even a few seconds. I started paying closer attention to how Clara managed her phone in other situations. When we're out with friends, she keeps it in her purse rather than on the table like most people do. If someone asks to see a photo she's mentioned taking, she'll angle the screen so only that specific photo is visible. When she's texting while we're together, she holds the phone at angles that make it impossible for me to see the screen, even if I wanted to. It's like she's developed this whole system of phone management designed to prevent anyone from accidentally seeing any of her digital communications. The strangest incident happened last month when Clara fell asleep on my couch while we were watching a late movie. Her phone was on the coffee table next to us, and it kept lighting up with notifications throughout the night. I wasn't trying to read her messages, but the constant buzzing and screen lighting was keeping me awake. When I reached over to flip the phone face down so the light wouldn't be as distracting, Clara immediately woke up and asked what I was doing with her phone. She'd gone from deep sleep to wide awake the moment I moved near her phone, like she had some kind of sixth sense that detected when someone was approaching her device. When I explained that I was just trying to stop the screen from lighting up the room, Clara said she was a light sleeper and had heard me moving around. But the timing was too perfect, and her level of alertness was too immediate for someone who'd supposedly just been awakened by random movement. I've started to wonder if there's something specific Clara is hiding, or if this is just an extreme version of normal privacy preferences. When I've tried to discuss it with her, she accuses me of being controlling and says that wanting space and privacy in a relationship is healthy. And she's right about that too. Privacy is important, and nobody should have to share every detail of their digital life with their partner. But Clara's behaviour goes so far beyond normal privacy that it's starting to affect how I feel about our relationship. Well, that wraps up another collection of stories that prove human behaviour never fails to surprise us. Whether you were grinding levels, tackling that work project, or just needed something to fill the background noise, hopefully these tales of everyday chaos kept you entertained without demanding too much of your attention. From friends who've mastered the art of selective wallet amnesia to neighbours who think property lines are more like gentle suggestions, we've covered the full spectrum of boundary-crossing behaviour that makes you appreciate the relatively normal people in your own life. If any of these stories hit a little too close to home, just remember that you're not alone in dealing with people who seem to operate by their own unique set of rules. And if you made it through all these without questioning your faith in humanity, well, you're probably more optimistic than the rest of us. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll catch you in the next one with more stories that'll make you grateful for your own drama-free existence.